She stood in chains under the merciless sun, an 18-year-old girl being sold like cattle to pay a debt she never owed. Men circled, shouting prices, their eyes stripping away what little dignity she had left. This is the moment Elena Moore's life could have ended, or the moment it truly began. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Elena's journey travels. Because what happened next, when a quiet cowboy stepped forward with nothing but kindness and a worn blanket, would change everything. The summer of 1875 arrived in western Kansas like a punishment from an angry sky. The sun hammered down on the small cattle town of Redemption with such ferocity that even the lizards sought shelter beneath the wooden boardwalks. Dust devils spun through the main street, carrying with them the smell of animal sweat, manure, and something else, something darker that hung in the air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite die. Elena Moore had learned to recognize that smell. It was the scent of desperation, of lives being traded and futures being sold. She had smelled it growing up in her father's failing general store, watched it settle into the lines around her mother's eyes before consumption took her 3 years ago. And now, standing on a crude wooden platform at the edge of the cattle market with iron shackles cutting into her wrists, she could taste it on her tongue like copper. The auction platform stood in the center of the market square, positioned deliberately where everyone could see, where everyone would be forced to witness what was happening. Around her, cattle lowed in their pens, oblivious to the human transaction taking place mere yards away. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She was being sold with less ceremony than the livestock. Lot 47. The auctioneer's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. He was a thin man with a cruel mouth and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. Silas Crow's man, through and through. One female, 18 years of age, healthy, unblemished, able-bodied, opening bid at $50 to settle the Moore family debt. Elena's legs trembled beneath her simple cotton dress, the same dress she'd been wearing when they came for her 2 days ago. She hadn't been given time to pack, to say goodbye to the small room above the store that had been her entire world. Silas Crow's men had simply arrived at dawn, waving papers that her father had signed in a moment of weakness and whiskey, and taken her like she was already property. The crowd gathered slowly, curiosity and cruelty drawing them like flies to spoiled meat. Townspeople she'd known her entire life. Mrs. Henderson, who used to buy fabric from their store. Thomas Wright, who'd once asked her to dance at the summer social. The Reverend's wife, who'd taught her to read. They all came to watch. Some had the decency to look uncomfortable. Most simply stared. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer scanned the crowd with practiced efficiency. Elena forced herself to stand straight, to keep her chin up even as her insides twisted into knots so tight she thought she might be sick right there on the platform. Her father had always told her that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you unless you surrendered it. She hadn't understood what he meant until now. A hand raised near the back. A rancher named Coleman, known for working his hands to exhaustion and his horses even worse. 50. $50, thank you, sir. Do I hear 60? Another hand. A merchant from 2 towns over, a man whose wife had died under suspicious circumstances the previous winter. 60. Elena's vision blurred at the edges. This was really happening. She was being sold to whoever had the most money and the least conscience. The shackles seemed to tighten around her wrists, though she knew it was impossible. They were already cutting into her skin, leaving raw marks that would scar. She wondered if that was intentional, a reminder of this day that she'd carry forever. 70! Someone else shouted. Elena didn't bother looking to see who. What did it matter? They were all the same, men who saw her as an acquisition, a solution to their loneliness or labor needs or baser desires. The sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat trickled down her spine, soaking into the thin fabric of her dress. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, assessing, judging, calculating her worth in dollars and cents. The exposure was worse than the heat. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the wooden planks beneath her feet and never surface again. $80. The voice belonged to a man she didn't recognize, someone new to town. He had the look of a prospector who'd struck it rich. Too much gold on his fingers, too much confidence in his stance. "That's more like it," The auctioneer's enthusiasm made Elena's stomach churn. $80 for this fine specimen. Do I hear 90? Specimen. Like she was a horse or a prize bull. Elena bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, using the pain to anchor herself to reality, to keep from screaming or crying or both. On the edge of the crowd, standing slightly apart from the press of bodies and noise, Caleb Rowan watched the proceedings with growing horror. He'd come to town for supplies. His 5-year-old daughter Molly perched on his hip, her small fingers playing with the frayed collar of his work shirt. He'd heard the commotion from the general store and come to investigate, expecting to find some dispute over cattle prices or grazing rights. Instead, he found this. "Daddy, why is that girl wearing chains?" Molly's voice was pure innocence, untainted by the ugliness unfolding before them. Caleb pulled his daughter closer, angling her face away from the platform. "Don't look, sweetheart." But he couldn't look away himself. The girl on the platform, young, too young, with dark hair that hung in matted waves around her face, stood with a kind of desperate dignity that made his chest ache. Her eyes, even from this distance, held the look of a wild animal caught in a trap, knowing that freedom meant chewing off its own leg. $90. Coleman again, his face flushed with excitement, or drink, or both. Caleb had known there were men who dealt in human transactions, had heard rumors of debt bondage and indentured servitude in the territories. But he'd never witnessed it himself, had never imagined it could happen so brazenly, in broad daylight, with half the town watching like it was entertainment. 100! The prospector, not to be outdone. The girl, Elena, he heard someone nearby whisper her name, swayed slightly on the platform. For a moment, Caleb thought she might faint. He saw her hands clench into fists despite the shackles, saw the way she locked her knees to keep standing. She was fighting to stay conscious, to maintain some shred of control over a situation where she had none. $100. The auctioneer's voice climbed higher. Surely this girl is worth more than 100. Look at her, strong, young, capable. She'll work for years, provide value far exceeding the investment. Do I hear 110? Molly twisted in Caleb's arms, trying to see despite his attempts to shield her. Is she being sold, Daddy? Like the cows? The simple question, asked with childlike directness, cut through Caleb's paralysis. His daughter was seeing this, would remember this, would learn from this moment what kind of world she lived in, what kind of man her father was. 120! A new voice, gravelly and mean. Caleb recognized it. Jake Thornton, a ranch hand with a reputation for violence and a history of bruised women. Elena heard that voice, too. She knew Thornton by reputation, had seen him throw a dog against a wall once for barking at him. Her breathing quickened, panic rising like floodwater threatening to drown her. Not him. Please, not him. $120. The auctioneer's smile widened. Now we're getting somewhere. Do I hear 130? The crowd had grown thicker, more people drawn by the spectacle. Some whispered to each other. A few looked genuinely disturbed, but no one moved to stop it. No one challenged the legality or morality of what was happening. They just watched, passive witnesses to an injustice that would stain their town's history. Elena's gaze swept across the sea of faces, searching for something. Compassion, outrage, recognition that this was wrong. But she found mostly curiosity, some hunger, and worst of all, indifference. These people who'd known her since childhood had already decided she was someone else's problem, someone else's property. Her father had disappeared 2 weeks ago, fled in the night like a coward, leaving behind debts he'd accumulated through gambling and bad business decisions. Silas Crow, who owned half the county through similarly predatory loans, had decided that Elena would settle those debts. The local sheriff, comfortably in Crow's pocket, had signed the papers without question. 130! Someone else. Elena had lost track of who was bidding, the voices blurring together into a nightmarish chorus. $130. Do I hear 140? Caleb shifted Molly to his other hip, his mind racing. He'd come to town with $73, money saved carefully over months of hard work on his ranch, money meant for winter supplies and new equipment. It wasn't enough to win the auction, not at the rate the bidding was climbing. But he couldn't walk away. Couldn't let his daughter witness this cruelty and do nothing. Couldn't look himself in the mirror knowing he'd stood by while a young girl was sold to the highest bidder like a piece of furniture. His wife Rachel had died 3 years ago, giving birth to their second child, a son who'd followed her into death before the sun set that same day. Since then, Caleb had poured all his grief and love into Molly, determined to raise her in a world that was better, kinder, more just than the one that had taken her mother. How could he do that if he let this happen? 140! Thornton again, his voice carrying a note of possessive triumph that made Caleb's skin crawl. Elena's knees did buckle this time. She caught herself, but barely, her shackled hands jerking upward reflexively. The chains rattled, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of everyone present for years to come, whether they admitted it or not. Going once at $140. The auctioneer raised his hand, preparing for the final countdown. Caleb made a decision. It was probably foolish, certainly impractical, definitely would complicate his life in ways he couldn't predict. But it was right. And sometimes, right was all that mattered. He pushed through the crowd, Molly still in his arms, people parting reluctantly to let him pass. His heart hammered against his ribs, his mouth dry despite the heat. He'd never been comfortable with attention, preferred the quiet solitude of his ranch to the noise of town. But this moment demanded more than comfort. Going twice. The auctioneer's hand descended. 175. Caleb's voice cut through the square, quiet but clear. The crowd turned as one, surprised murmurs rippling through the assembly. The auctioneer paused, his hand frozen mid-gesture. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes finding Caleb's across the distance. I'm sorry? The auctioneer's confidence faltered. Did you say $175? Caleb repeated, louder this time. Every cent I have. Thornton spun around, his face contorted with anger. That's $35 more than the last bid, Rowan. You can't just... I can. And I did. Caleb met the man's glare steadily. Unless you want to go higher. The challenge hung in the air. Thornton's hand moved toward his belt, where a knife handle protruded. Caleb didn't flinch, though he adjusted Molly's position slightly, making sure she was protected. Jake. The auctioneer's voice carried a warning. Silas Crow wanted money, not bloodshed, in the town square. Do you have more to bid? Thornton's jaw worked, fury and calculation warring on his face. Finally, he spat into the dust and stalked away, shouldering through the crowd with violence in every movement. Going once at $175. The auctioneer recovered his composure quickly. Going twice, sold to Mr. Caleb Rowan. The words echoed across the square, sealing Elena's fate. She stared at the man who'd just bought her, a stranger with a weathered face and kind eyes, holding a small child with blonde curls. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. She'd simply traded one unknown master for another. Caleb handed Molly to Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor woman he trusted, then climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, Elena looked even younger, even more frightened. Bruises marked her wrists where the shackles had cut into her skin. Dust and sweat streaked her face, and her dress was torn at the hem. The money, Mr. Rowan. The auctioneer held out his hand, all business now that the drama had concluded. Caleb pulled out his leather wallet, emptying it completely. The bills and coins represented months of work, of sacrifice, of careful planning. He handed them over without hesitation. The auctioneer counted quickly, then nodded. Exactly $175. He produced a key from his vest pocket. She's all yours. Do you want the chains? The question was so casually cruel that Caleb had to restrain himself from putting his fist through the man's face. Instead, he held out his hand for the key. I'll handle it from here. He turned to Elena, whose entire body had gone rigid with tension. Her eyes, green, he noticed now, the color of new leaves, watched him with wary desperation. I'm going to remove the shackles, Caleb said quietly. His voice meant only for her. I need you to hold still. Can you do that? Elena managed a small nod. She couldn't speak, didn't trust her voice not to break completely. Caleb unlocked the shackles as gently as possible, but even so, Elena gasped when the metal finally released her wrists. Blood welled from the wounds, trickling down her palms. She swayed again, the sudden absence of weight throwing off her balance. Caleb caught her elbow, steadying her. Easy, I've got you. Those 3 words, simple, ordinary words, nearly undid Elena completely. When had anyone last said something like that to her? When had anyone caught her, supported her, promised stability in any form? From the edge of the platform, Caleb retrieved a worn wool blanket he'd had draped over his shoulder, the same blanket he'd used to carry supplies earlier. Without asking permission, without explaining, he wrapped it around Elena's shoulders, covering the thin cotton dress that had been designed more for modesty than comfort, more for display than protection. The gesture confused Elena. It wasn't cold. The day was brutally hot. But she understood after a moment what he was really offering: coverage, privacy. A barrier between her body and all those watching eyes. The blanket was heavy and warm, but she pulled it tighter anyway, grateful for anything that might make her feel less exposed. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked. Elena tested her legs, which felt like water beneath her. "I think so." "Then let's get out of here." He helped her down the platform steps, one hand under her elbow, moving slowly enough that she wouldn't stumble. The crowd parted for them, but not in the respectful way they might part for a couple. Instead, people stepped back with a mixture of fascination and judgment, already forming opinions, already composing the gossip they'd spread over dinner tables that evening. Mrs. Patterson handed Molly back to Caleb. The little girl stared at Elena with open curiosity, her blue eyes wide. "Is she coming home with us, Daddy?" Caleb shifted Molly to his other hip, still keeping a supportive hand near Elena's elbow. "Yes, sweetheart, she is." "What's your name?" Molly addressed Elena directly, with the fearless friendliness of childhood. Elena's voice came out rough, scraping past the lump in her throat. "Elena." "That's pretty. I'm Molly. I'm 5 years old." She held up her hand with all 5 fingers spread wide, as if this information might not be clear otherwise. "Do you like horses?" "We have horses. And chickens?" "The chickens are silly." Despite everything, the horror of the last hour, the uncertainty of her future, the pain in her wrists, Elena felt her mouth twitch toward something that might have been a smile in different circumstances. Caleb's wagon waited at the edge of the market, a sturdy, if unimpressive vehicle loaded with sacks of grain and supplies. He helped Elena climb into the back, then settled Molly beside her before taking the driver's seat himself. As they pulled away from the market square, Elena risked a glance back. The auction platform stood empty now, ready for the next transaction. The crowd had already dispersed, moving on to other business as if nothing significant had happened. As if a girl's entire life hadn't just been bought and sold. She clutched the blanket tighter, her damaged wrists throbbing with each heartbeat. She didn't know what would happen next, what this man Caleb Rowan would expect from her, what rights he thought he'd purchased with his $175. The not knowing was almost worse than knowing something terrible. At least with terrible, you could prepare yourself. The wagon rattled out of town, leaving behind the noise and crowds and judgment. The prairie stretched out on all sides, endless golden grassland broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings or lonely stands of cottonwood trees. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Molly chattered away, pointing out landmarks. "That's where we saw the coyote. That's where Daddy's horse threw a shoe," filling the silence with childlike observations that required no response. Elena was grateful for it. She couldn't have managed conversation anyway, not with her thoughts still spinning, still trying to process what had happened. After perhaps 20 minutes, Caleb glanced back over his shoulder. "There's water in the canteen by your feet. You should drink." It wasn't a command exactly, more like a suggestion from someone who recognized thirst when he saw it. Elena found the canteen and drank deeply, the water warm but welcome. She hadn't realized how parched she was until the first swallow hit her stomach. "Thank you," she managed. Caleb nodded but said nothing more. Molly had fallen asleep against Elena's side, the excitement and heat finally catching up to her. Elena looked down at the small girl, so trusting, so innocent, and felt something crack open in her chest, some chamber she'd sealed shut when the men came to take her. The Rowan Ranch appeared gradually, emerging from the prairie like something that had always been there, waiting. It wasn't large, a modest house, A barn that needed repairs, corrals and outbuildings in various states of maintenance. But it looked solid, permanent, real. Elena had expected something worse, though she wasn't sure why. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and carefully lifted Molly, who barely stirred. "I'll show you inside once I get her settled." Elena climbed down from the wagon on her own, legs shaky but functional. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, but she caught it, still reluctant to let it go. It was armor of sorts, the only thing between her and complete vulnerability. She stood in the dusty yard, surrounded by the sounds of late afternoon, chickens clucking in their coop, a horse whinnying from the barn, cicadas beginning their evening song. The ordinary sounds of life continuing, oblivious to how much everything had changed. Caleb emerged from the house a few minutes later, Molly presumably tucked into bed. He approached Elena slowly, the way you might approach a skittish horse. "You're probably wondering what happens now," he said. Elena's throat tightened. Here it came. The demands, the expectations, the truth of what she'd been purchased for. She forced herself to meet his eyes, determined to face it with what remained of her dignity. "I don't expect anything from you," Caleb continued, his voice steady and quiet. "I didn't buy you to work for me, or to serve any other purpose. I bought you because what was happening back there was wrong, and I couldn't let it continue." Elena stared at him, trying to understand. Men didn't spend money without expecting something in return. That was the basic arithmetic of survival. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I know." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable with his own generosity. "But it's true. There's a room in the house you can use. It's small, but it's private. There's a lock on the door. You'll have the only key. You're free to come and go as you please, eat what you need from the kitchen, use whatever you find necessary." "For how long?" The question surprised him. "For as long as you want. This isn't temporary, Elena. This is me giving you a place to land until you figure out what you want to do next." Elena's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. It had to be a trick. Men like this didn't exist. Kindness like this didn't exist. Not in her experience. Not in her world. "What do you want in return?" She hated the way her voice shook, hated showing weakness, but she needed to know. Caleb met her gaze directly. "Nothing. I want nothing in return." "That's not how this works." Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "You paid money for me. You bought me. That means I owe you something. Work, service, my—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "No." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not how this works. That's how Silas Crow and men like him, want you to think it works. But I'm not them. I don't own you, Elena. Nobody owns you. You're a person, not property, regardless of what papers say or money changed hands." Elena wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt worse than the wounds on her wrists. But believing meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability meant getting hurt. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly. "I'll show you the room," Caleb said after a moment of heavy silence. "You can decide what you want to do after you've had a chance to rest and eat something. No decisions need to be made tonight." He led her into the house, which was modest but well-maintained. The main room held a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, and a table with mismatched chairs. Children's drawings decorated one wall. Molly's artwork, Elena guessed. The house smelled like wood smoke and something baking, lived in and real. "This way," Caleb gestured down a short hallway. The room he showed her was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, small dresser, and wooden chair it contained. But it had a window that looked out over the prairie, and as Caleb had promised, a door with a lock and a key, which he placed in Elena's damaged palm. "There's a basin and pitcher for washing," he said, pointing to the dresser. "I'll bring some salve for your wrists, and I'll leave food on the table whenever you're ready to eat. No rush." Elena stood in the center of the small room, clutching the key like a lifeline. She couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. Caleb paused in the doorway. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me. I know that everything in your recent experience has taught you that people will hurt you, use you, let you down. But I'm asking you to consider the possibility that this, right here, right now, is different. that there are still people in this world who will do the right thing, even when it costs them something. He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, then crossed to the door and turned the lock. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the sweetest thing she'd heard in weeks. She was alone. She was safe. She was behind a locked door with the only key. The tears came then, hot and furious and unstoppable. She sank onto the edge of the bed, still wrapped in Caleb's blanket, and wept for everything she'd lost, everything she'd endured, and, most dangerously, for the tiny seed of hope that had just been planted in the wreckage of her heart. Outside, the sun continued its descent, painting the prairie gold and amber. Somewhere in the house, Caleb sat at his kitchen table, wondering if he'd done the right thing, if $175 was enough to save a life, if kindness could heal wounds that deep. In the chicken coop, the hens settled onto their roosts. In the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls. And in the small room at the end of the hallway, Elena Moore cried herself into an exhausted sleep, her first night in a place that might, just might, become something close to home. The evening deepened into full darkness, and with it came the sounds of the prairie at night, owls hunting, coyotes calling, the wind rustling through the grass. Natural sounds, ancient sounds, sounds that predated human cruelty and would continue long after. And in that darkness, in that small ranch house on the Kansas prairie, 3 lives intersected in ways none of them could have predicted. A cowboy trying to do right by his daughter and his own sense of justice. A child whose innocence might bridge gaps that adults couldn't cross. And a girl learning that sometimes, when everything has been taken from you, the hardest thing to accept is when something is freely given. The night settled over them all, a blanket of stars stretching from horizon to horizon, indifferent to human suffering and human kindness alike. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Elena slept behind a locked door with a key in her pocket and a blanket that smelled like safety. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Elena woke to unfamiliar silence. Not the oppressive silence of the locked storage room where Crow's men had kept her, nor the terrifying quiet before the auction. This was different, peaceful, almost gentle. Birdsong filtered through the window, accompanied by the distant sound of chickens and the creak of the windmill turning in the morning breeze. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back, the auction, the chains, the man named Caleb who'd paid everything he had and asked for nothing in return. Her hand moved instinctively to her pocket, fingers closing around the small iron key. Still there, still real. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, painting golden squares on the worn wooden floor. Elena sat up slowly, her body protesting. Every muscle ached from the tension of yesterday, from standing on that platform trying not to collapse. Her wrists throbbed where the shackles had cut into her skin, the wounds angry and raw in the morning light. She should get up, she thought, should find out what was expected of her, what work needed doing to justify her presence here. The old instinct, born from years of her father's demands and reinforced by terror, insisted that idleness would be punished, that staying in bed meant shirking duties that would be added to some invisible debt she owed. But Caleb had said she owed nothing. The memory of his words made her chest tight with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. Men didn't act that way. In Elena's experience, everyone wanted something, and kindness was just the pretty wrapping around ugly demands. A soft knock on the door made her freeze. "Elena?" A child's voice, bright and curious. "Are you awake? Daddy made breakfast and he said I shouldn't bother you, but I wanted to see if you were okay because you were crying last night and I heard it through the wall, and Daddy said sometimes people cry when they're sad or scared or tired, and maybe you were all 3, and that's a lot of crying reasons." Despite everything, Elena felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. She crossed to the door and unlocked it, opening it just enough to see Molly standing in the hallway, already dressed for the day in a simple blue dress, her blonde curls escaping from 2 neat braids. "I'm okay," Elena said, her voice rough from sleep and yesterday's tears. Molly's face brightened. "Good. Are you hungry? Daddy made eggs and biscuits, and there's jam from last summer when we picked berries and made it ourselves. Well, I helped a little, but mostly I ate the berries." She giggled at her own confession. "Do you like jam?" I do, Elena managed, overwhelmed by the child's cheerful assault of words. Come on, then. Molly reached out and grabbed Elena's hand before she could react, tugging her toward the kitchen. The casual touch, so innocent and trusting, made Elena's throat constrict. When was the last time someone had touched her without threat or transaction behind it? The kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house, heat radiating from the cast-iron stove where Caleb stood with his back to them, sliding eggs onto 2 plates. He turned when he heard them enter, and Elena saw surprise cross his face. Surprise that she'd emerged from the room, perhaps, or surprise at his daughter's successful recruitment. Morning, he said simply. Hope you're hungry. Elena wasn't sure she could eat, her stomach still knotted with anxiety and uncertainty. But refusing felt dangerous, like it might upset the fragile equilibrium of this strange new situation. She nodded and let Molly lead her to the table. Caleb placed a plate in front of her. 2 eggs, 3 biscuits, a generous spoonful of golden jam. More food than she'd seen in the 2 days of captivity. More than she'd eaten in the weeks before, when her father's creditors had begun circling and money for groceries had evaporated. There's coffee if you want it, Caleb offered, gesturing to the pot on the stove. Or water. Molly drinks milk, but we've only got enough for her right now. Water is fine, Elena said quietly. Thank you. She ate slowly, aware of Molly watching her with open fascination while Caleb busied himself at the stove, giving her space. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the biscuits light and flaky, the jam sweet with the taste of summer. Each bite felt surreal, like she was play-acting at normalcy in someone else's life. Do you have a mama? Molly asked suddenly, with the blunt curiosity of childhood that didn't yet understand which questions caused pain. Molly, Caleb's voice carried a gentle warning. It's all right, Elena said, though it wasn't, not really. My mother died 3 years ago. Consumption. My mama died too, Molly announced matter-of-factly. When I was 2, I don't remember her much, but Daddy tells me stories. She had yellow hair like me, and she loved horses, and she sang pretty songs. She tilted her head, studying Elena. Do you miss your mama? Every day, Elena whispered. Me too, Molly said, as if this shared experience of loss created an instant bond between them. Daddy says missing people means we loved them good, and that's not sad, even though it feels sad sometimes. Caleb cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable with the philosophical conversation his 5-year-old had initiated. Molly, finish your breakfast. We've got chores to do. Can Elena help? Molly turned to her father with pleading eyes. Please? I want to show her the chickens and the garden and the creek where the frogs live. Elena tensed, waiting for Caleb's response. Here it came, the real expectation, the work that would be demanded in exchange for the food and shelter. But Caleb just shook his head gently. Elena needs time to rest and heal. Those wounds on her wrists need tending, and I imagine she's exhausted. Maybe in a few days, if she wants to, she can see the ranch. But today, she should take it easy. But, Molly started to protest. No buts, sweetheart. How would you feel if you'd had a day like Elena had yesterday? Would you want to run around doing chores? Molly considered this seriously. Probably not. I'd probably want to hide under my bed forever. Exactly, Caleb said. So we give Elena space to do whatever she needs to do. Elena stared at her plate, processing this. He was still asking nothing from her, still treating her like a guest rather than property or labor. It didn't make sense. Men didn't work this way. There had to be a catch, an angle, a moment when the mask would slip and the real demands would surface. After breakfast, Caleb retrieved a small tin from a cabinet and set it on the table in front of Elena. Salve for your wrists. It'll help with the infection that's starting and ease the pain some. You should apply it twice a day, morning and night. Elena opened the tin, the sharp scent of herbs filling her nose. Thank you. I'll be working on the fence line in the north pasture if you need anything, Caleb said, settling his hat on his head. Molly will be with me. The house is yours. There's food in the pantry, books on the shelf if you read, and if you want to rest more, that's fine too. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Elena, I meant what I said yesterday. You don't owe me anything. Not work, not gratitude, not explanations about your past or promises about your future. You're here because you need a safe place to land, and I can provide that. That's all this is. Then he was gone, Molly skipping after him, her chatter fading as they headed toward the barn. Elena sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the debris of breakfast and the strange kindness of strangers. She applied the salve to her wrist with shaking hands, the cooling sensation immediate and welcome. Then she washed the dishes because not doing so felt wrong, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind spun in confused circles. The house revealed itself slowly as she explored with careful steps, always listening for signs that she was overstepping, invading spaces not meant for her. The main room held evidence of the life lived here. Molly's drawings pinned to the wall with careful precision, a child's reader open on the side table, a man's work gloves folded neatly by the door. A photograph on the mantel showed a younger Caleb standing beside a woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile. Rachel, Elena guessed, the wife who'd died, Molly's mother. She moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. Most were practical, guides to ranching and animal husbandry, almanacs, a Bible that looked rarely opened. But there were others too, novels, poetry, even a collection of Shakespeare's plays. Someone in this house valued words, valued stories, valued the idea that life could be more than mere survival. Elena pulled out a slim volume of poetry and carried it to the sofa, curling into the corner like a child seeking shelter. She read slowly, the words washing over her like cool water on burned skin. When was the last time she'd had the luxury of reading for pleasure? Before her mother died, certainly. Before her father's drinking turned from occasional to constant. Before the world had narrowed to unpaid bills and angry creditors, and the constant fear of what would happen next. The morning slipped into afternoon. Elena dozed on the sofa, the book still open in her lap. She woke to the sound of Molly's laughter outside and Caleb's deeper voice responding to something his daughter had said. They entered through the back door, both dusty and sweaty from working in the heat. Molly spotted Elena immediately and rushed over, her face flushed with excitement. "Elena, you're still here! I thought maybe you might have left because sometimes people leave and don't come back, like Daddy's friend Thomas who went to California and never sent letters, even though he promised." She took a breath. "Are you going to stay?" The question, asked with such open vulnerability, made Elena's chest ache. "I'm still here," she said, which wasn't quite an answer but was all she could manage. Caleb washed his hands at the kitchen pump, then began preparing lunch. Cold chicken from the icebox, bread, cheese, apples from the root cellar. Elena stood to help, but he waved her back. "You're still healing. Sit." "I can help," Elena protested. "I should help. I can't just—" "You can," Caleb interrupted gently but firmly. "You can just rest. You can just exist here without earning your place. I know that probably feels impossible to believe, but it's true." Elena sank back onto the sofa, frustration and confusion warring in her chest. She'd been raised to be useful, to contribute, to justify the space she occupied and the resources she consumed. This enforced idleness felt like a trap, like she was accumulating invisible debt that would be called due when she least expected it. They ate lunch together, Molly chattering about the calf that had been born in the spring and the fox she'd seen near the creek and the way the barn cat had brought her a dead mouse as a gift, which was gross but also kind of sweet because it meant the cat liked her. "Do you like animals?" Molly asked Elena between bites of bread and cheese. "I do," Elena said. "We had a dog when I was younger. Before—" She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the series of losses that had brought her to yesterday's auction block. "Before what?" Molly asked with characteristic directness. "Molly," Caleb said quietly, "some stories are private." "Oh." Molly looked chagrined. "Sorry. Daddy says I ask too many questions sometimes." "You're curious," Elena said, surprising herself by reaching out to touch Molly's hand. "That's not a bad thing." After lunch, Caleb returned to his work while Molly settled at the table with her reader, sounding out words with determination that reminded Elena of herself at that age. Elena found herself drawn to the window, watching the prairie grass bend and sway in the wind like waves on an ocean. "Would you like to read with me?" Molly's voice broke into her thoughts. "Daddy usually helps, but he's busy and some of these words are really hard." Elena hesitated, then crossed to the table. For the next hour, she sat beside Molly, helping her navigate the simple story of a girl and her pony. Molly's enthusiasm was infectious, her pride in each successfully decoded word so genuine that Elena found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since her mother's death. "You're a good teacher," Molly announced when they finished the chapter. "Better than Miss Thompson at school because you don't get impatient when I mess up." "You're a good student," Elena replied. "You try hard. That matters more than getting it right the first time." Molly beamed at the praise, then threw her arms around Elena in a spontaneous hug that caught Elena completely off guard. The child's warmth, her unself-conscious affection, her willingness to trust and embrace this stranger, it was almost too much. Elena's arms came up slowly, carefully, returning the embrace with a gentleness that surprised her. When Molly pulled back, she was grinning. "I'm glad you're here, Elena. It's nice having another girl in the house. Daddy tries, but he doesn't understand girl things." "What kind of girl things?" Elena asked, amused despite herself. "Like how to braid hair properly, and which wildflowers make the best crowns, and why sometimes you just need to cry, even when nothing's really wrong." Molly's expression turned serious. "Daddy's good at lots of things, but those things confuse him." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, some protective wall she'd built around her heart, beginning to crumble under the assault of this child's innocent acceptance. That evening, Caleb made dinner, beef stew that had been simmering all day, filling the house with rich, savory smells. They ate together at the table, Molly dominating the conversation with her endless observations about the world. Elena listened more than she spoke, still uncertain of her place in this strange domestic scene. After dinner, after Molly had been bathed and put to bed with a story, Caleb returned to the main room where Elena sat with her borrowed poetry book. He poured 2 cups of coffee and offered her one, which she accepted carefully. "Can I ask you something?" he said, settling into the chair across from her. Elena tensed. "All right. What do you want?" "Not what you think I want to hear, not what you think you owe me. What do you actually want for yourself?" The question stunned her into silence. Want? When had anyone asked her what she wanted? Her father had told her what to do, Crow's men had told her what she was worth, the auction crowd had decided her fate. But want? That was a luxury she'd forgotten existed. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "That's fair," Caleb said. "You've been through hell. You don't have to have answers right now. But eventually, when you're ready, I want you to think about it. Because whatever you decide, staying here, moving on, starting over somewhere else, I'll help you get there." "Why?" The word burst out of Elena before she could stop it. "Why are you doing this? What do you get from helping me?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. 3 years ago, I watched my wife die. I held my son for the 2 hours he lived, watching him struggle for every breath. I stood by their graves and wondered why I was the one who survived, what the point was of going on alone. He looked up, meeting Elena's eyes. Molly was the answer. Taking care of her, raising her right, making sure she grows up knowing that the world has good in it. That's my purpose. That's what gets me out of bed every morning. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Yesterday, I had to make a choice. I could let Molly watch that auction happen and learn that sometimes people don't help even when they can, or I could show her that when you see something wrong, you step up. Even when it costs you, even when it's hard. He shook his head. I didn't buy you, Elena. I bought you away from people who would have hurt you. There's a difference. Elena's eyes burned with tears she was determined not to shed. You spent all your money, your winter supplies, your equipment fund. That's more than just setting an example. Money comes and goes, Caleb said simply. I'll work harder, cut corners, make do, but I couldn't live with myself if I'd walked away. And more importantly, I couldn't ask Molly to live in a world where her father valued money over doing what's right. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds, the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant calls of night birds. Elena turned his words over in her mind, testing them for weaknesses, searching for the hidden angle. But there was none. He meant it. The stranger with kind eyes and work-worn hands genuinely expected nothing from her except that she give herself time to heal. I don't know how to do this, Elena admitted quietly. I don't know how to just be without owing something. without calculating what I need to do to avoid punishment or earn my keep. Then learn, Caleb said gently, one day at a time, no rush. Over the following days, Elena began to find a rhythm. Mornings were quiet. Caleb and Molly rose early for chores while Elena slept late, her body recovering from weeks of stress and fear. She'd wake to find breakfast waiting, still warm on the stove, and eat alone while reading or simply staring out the window at the endless prairie. Afternoons belonged to Molly. The child had latched onto Elena with determination, dragging her into games and adventures that required nothing more than imagination and willingness to play. They built forts from blankets in the main room, read stories under the oak tree behind the house, picked wildflowers and wove them into crowns that fell apart almost immediately. "You're sad a lot," Molly observed one afternoon as they sat by the creek, watching tadpoles dart through the shallows. "Daddy says that's okay, that sad is just a feeling, and feelings are allowed." "Your daddy's right," Elena said. "Are you sad because of the chains and the men who were mean?" Elena considered how much truth a 5-year-old could handle. "Partly. And partly because I lost things that mattered to me, my mother, my home, my sense of safety in the world." Molly nodded sagely. "When I'm sad, Daddy lets me cry, and then we talk about good things that are still true, like how the sun comes up every morning, and the chickens always lay eggs, and love doesn't stop even when people go away." The simple wisdom of it made Elena's throat tight. "That sounds like a good approach." "What are some good things that are still true for you?" Molly asked. Elena thought about it. "I'm alive. I'm safe. And I met a little girl who's teaching me how to make flower crowns that actually stay together." Molly giggled. "That last one isn't true yet. They keep falling apart." "We'll keep practicing then." Evenings were different, quieter, more adult. After Molly went to bed, Elena would sit with Caleb in the main room, usually in comfortable silence. He'd work on tack that needed mending or review accounts in his ledger, while she read or simply existed in the peaceful space he'd created. Sometimes they talked, small conversations at first, Elena asking about the ranch, Caleb explaining the rhythms of cattle raising and crop rotation. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Elena found herself telling him about her mother, about the woman who'd taught her to read and bake and see beauty in small things, about the store her father had run before grief and whiskey destroyed him, about the slow erosion of security that had led to yesterday's horror. Caleb listened without judgment, without offering platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply heard her, witnessed her pain, acknowledged that what had happened to her was wrong. His listening was a gift in itself. A week passed, then 2. Elena's wrists healed, the angry wounds fading to pink scars that would mark her forever. She began helping with small tasks around the house. Not because Caleb demanded it, but because idleness had begun to feel like its own prison. She cooked meals, discovering that creating something good from simple ingredients brought satisfaction she hadn't expected. She mended Molly's torn dresses and Caleb's work shirts, her needle moving in neat, precise stitches. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said one evening, watching her repair a rip in his good shirt, the one he wore to town. "I know," Elena replied. "I want to." It was true. Somewhere in the quiet days and peaceful nights, she'd stopped operating from fear and obligation. The things she did now, she chose. That made all the difference. But peace was fragile, and the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. One afternoon, as Elena and Molly returned from the creek with a bucket of blackberries, they found a stranger waiting at the house. A man Elena didn't recognize, dressed too well for ranch work, sitting astride a fine horse. "Can I help you?" Caleb's voice was carefully neutral as he approached from the barn, but Elena saw tension in his shoulders. "Name's Wesley Crown. I work for Mr. Silas Crow." The man's smile was all politeness and threat. "I'm here to discuss a matter of property." Elena's blood turned to ice. She pulled Molly behind her instinctively, positioning herself between the child and this representative of the man who'd sold her. "I don't have any property disputes with Crow," Caleb said evenly. "Not property, exactly." Wesley's gaze slid to Elena. "More like a contractual misunderstanding. You see, Mr. Crow holds legitimate debt papers on the Moore family. When the debt couldn't be paid, he exercised his legal right to seizure of assets, in this case, the daughter. The auction was a legitimate business transaction, which I participated in, Caleb pointed out. I was the highest bidder. I paid in full. The transaction is complete. Ah, but that's where things get interesting. Wesley pulled a document from his saddlebag. Seems there was a clerical error. The girl wasn't supposed to be sold outright, just placed in indentured servitude for 7 years, after which time her debt would be considered paid and she'd be free to go. That's not what the auctioneer said. Caleb's voice had gone cold. Mistakes happen in the heat of the moment. Mr. Crow is prepared to be reasonable. Return the girl and he'll refund your purchase price. Everyone walks away satisfied. I'm not a girl. Elena's voice surprised even herself, steady and clear despite the fear coursing through her veins. I'm a person, and I'm not going anywhere. Wesley's smile widened, showing too many teeth. That's not really your decision, Miss Moore. The law is quite clear on matters of debt and obligation. The law is also clear on fraud, Caleb said quietly. Changing the terms of sale after the fact. That's what this is, isn't it? Crow realized he could make more money keeping Elena in long-term servitude than from a one-time auction, so he sent you to retrieve his investment. I'm not sure I appreciate your tone, Rowan. And I don't appreciate men who profit off human suffering. Caleb stepped closer, his hand resting casually near the rifle he'd propped against the porch post. Elena stays. If Crow wants to challenge that, he can take it up with the circuit judge when he comes through next month. Wesley's expression hardened. Mr. Crow won't be pleased. Then Mr. Crow shouldn't have sold her in the first place. Good day, Wesley, and tell your boss that if anyone comes out here to harass us again, they'll find a different reception than polite conversation. For a tense moment, Wesley looked like he might push the issue. Then he tipped his hat, his smile returning, but his eyes like flint. We'll be seeing each other again, Rowan. Count on it. He rode away, dust rising from his horse's hooves. They watched until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did Elena realize she was shaking, her hand gripping Molly's shoulder so tightly the child squirmed. Sorry, she whispered, releasing her hold. Molly turned and hugged her hard. Don't let them take you, please. Caleb crossed to them, his face troubled. They won't. I promise, Elena, they won't. But Elena heard the doubt underneath his certainty. Crow was powerful, influential, connected. He owned half the county through debt and intimidation. What was one cowboy's promise against that? That night, Elena lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling while fear spiraled through her. She'd been foolish to think she could escape, to believe that Caleb's kindness could protect her from men like Crow. The world didn't work that way. Power always won. Money always won. Girls like her always lost. She should run. Disappear into the night before Crow's men came back with the sheriff and legal documents that would drag her away in chains again. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. Because running meant leaving Molly, leaving Caleb, leaving this fragile sense of safety and home she'd begun to build. And somehow, impossibly, that mattered more than her own survival. She was still awake when dawn crept through her window, painting the room in shades of rose and gold. She heard Caleb moving in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of breakfast preparation. After a moment's hesitation, she rose and joined him. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening with understanding. Couldn't sleep? No. Me either. He poured coffee, handed her a cup. Elena, I need you to know something. I meant what I said yesterday. They won't take you. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, you're under my protection now. You shouldn't make promises you can't keep, Elena said quietly. Crow is powerful. I know. But power isn't everything. Sometimes doing what's right matters more. He met her eyes. And sometimes being willing to stand up to power is the only thing that stops it from consuming everything good. They stood together in the early morning light, two people damaged by loss, connected by circumstance, choosing to believe that kindness and courage might be enough to hold back the darkness gathering on the horizon. From her bedroom, Molly called out, her voice still thick with sleep. Daddy, is Elena still here? She's still here, sweetheart, Caleb called back. Good, came the sleepy reply. I love her. Elena's eyes filled with tears. In 2 weeks, this child had given her something she'd thought lost forever, the ability to love and be loved without condition or cost. Whatever came next, whatever Crow had planned, she would face it. Not alone. Not anymore. The day unfolded with determined normalcy. Caleb worked on repairs to the barn roof, while Molly helped Elena plant herbs in the kitchen garden. They moved through familiar rhythms, finding comfort in routine even as uncertainty shadowed every moment. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple, Elena stood at the window and made a decision. She wouldn't be passive anymore, wouldn't wait for Crow to decide her fate. She'd been sold once. She'd been claimed as property, as collateral, as something less than human. Never again. "Caleb," she said, turning from the window, "I need to learn to protect myself. To shoot, to fight if necessary. I won't be helpless anymore." He looked up from the accounts he'd been reviewing, surprise crossing his face. Then something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition of the strength it took to claim agency after having it stripped away. "All right," he said simply. "We'll start tomorrow." And Elena nodded, feeling something shift inside her. She'd been a victim. She'd been property. She'd been terrified and broken and lost. But here, in this small ranch house with a kind man and his daughter, she was becoming something new, someone who wouldn't run, someone who would stand and fight for the first time in her life. The future was uncertain. Danger gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. But for the first time since her mother's death, Elena felt something stronger than fear. She felt ready. The morning arrived cold and clear, frost coating the prairie grass like scattered diamonds. Elena stood in the yard behind the barn, her breath forming small clouds in the dawn air, while Caleb set up tin cans on a fence post 20 yards away. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to do. "The rifle kicks harder than you'd expect," Caleb said, returning to where she stood. "First time I fired one, I was about 10 years old, and it knocked me flat on my backside. My father laughed so hard he couldn't breathe." Elena tried to smile at the story, but couldn't quite manage it. The rifle in Caleb's hands looked heavy and foreign, a tool of violence that went against everything her mother had taught her about gentleness and peace. But her mother was dead, and gentleness hadn't protected Elena from chains and auction blocks. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You can," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "Fear is just your body preparing you to act. The question is whether you'll let it paralyze you or push you forward." He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel and breathe through the moment before pulling the trigger. His instructions were patient, methodical, free of condescension. He treated her like someone capable of learning, of becoming dangerous in her own defense. The first shot went wide, the recoil jarring through Elena's entire body. The second missed by less. By the 10th, she'd found a rhythm. Breathe in, exhale halfway, squeeze the trigger in the pause between heartbeats. A tin can flew backward off the fence post, and Elena felt something fierce and new bloom in her chest. "Good," Caleb said, approval evident in his voice. Again. They practiced until the sun climbed higher and Molly emerged from the house, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The little girl watched with serious attention as Elena hit 3 cans in succession, then ran over and threw her arms around Elena's waist. "You're really good at shooting," Molly exclaimed. "Like Annie Oakley in the stories." "I don't know about that," Elena said, but she felt stronger somehow, more solid, less like something that could be taken and more like someone who could fight back. Over the next week, the lessons continued. Caleb taught her to fight with her hands, basic strikes and blocks, ways to break free from holds, vulnerable points on a man's body where even someone small could inflict serious damage. He was gentle during these sessions but honest, not coddling her or pretending the world was safer than it was. "The goal isn't to win a fight," he explained one afternoon as they practiced in the barn, away from Molly's curious eyes. "It's to create enough chaos and pain that you can escape. Hit hard, hit fast, and run like hell." Elena practiced until her muscles burned and sweat soaked through her borrowed shirt. Each movement drove out a piece of the helplessness that had defined her for so long. She was done being afraid, done being prey. But fear found them anyway, arriving on a hot afternoon 2 weeks after Wesley Crown's visit. Elena was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud approaching from the east, too large for a single rider, too fast for casual travel. Her stomach dropped. "Caleb," she called toward the barn, trying to keep her voice steady. He emerged immediately, reading the urgency in her tone. His eyes found the approaching riders, and his jaw tightened. "Get Molly. Take her inside and lock the door. Don't come out until I say." "I'm not hiding," Elena said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Elena," I said, "I'm not hiding. Not anymore." They stared at each other for a tense moment. Then Caleb nodded slowly, respect and concern warring in his expression. "Stay behind me. If shooting starts, you run. Promise me." "I promise," Elena lied. The riders resolved into 5 men led by Silas Crow himself. Elena had never seen him up close before. He'd conducted his business through intermediaries and lawyers, never dirtying his hands directly. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with sharp features and eyes like a snake assessing prey. Expensive clothes marked him as wealthy, but there was something cheap about him anyway, something that no amount of money could polish. "Rowan," Crow said pleasantly as he reined his horse to a stop. His men fanned out behind him, hands resting casually near their weapons. "We have business to discuss." "I believe Wesley delivered my answer," Caleb replied, positioning himself between Elena and the riders. "There's nothing more to discuss." "Ah, but I'm afraid there is." Crow's smile was all politeness wrapped around menace. "You see, I've been very patient, very reasonable, but patience has limits, and you've exceeded mine." From inside the house, Elena could hear Molly crying, the sound muffled but desperate. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to stay still, to trust that the little girl would stay safe behind the locked door. "The girl belongs to me," Crow continued conversationally. "Legal debts, legal seizure, legal auction." But that auction was conducted under false pretenses. My man explained this. 7 years of labor, not outright sale. I'm willing to compensate you for the misunderstanding. $300, nearly twice what you paid. That's more than fair. "She's not for sale," Caleb said flatly. "Not for 300, not for 3,000. Elena is under my protection, and that's where she stays." Crow's expression hardened. "Your protection? Who exactly do you think you are, Rowan? Some knight in a fairy tale? You're a dirt farmer with a failing ranch and a dead wife. You're nobody." "Maybe so," Caleb agreed. "But I'm nobody who keeps his promises, and I promised Elena safety. So unless you've brought the circuit judge and proper legal documents, not the forgeries Wesley tried to pass off, you're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave." One of Crow's men laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. 5 against 1. You really want to play those odds?" 6 against 5, Elena said, stepping out from behind Caleb before he could stop her. Her voice shook but held. "I can shoot, and I will if you try to take me." Crow's eyes slid to her, calculation evident in his gaze. "Elena Moore, you've caused me considerable inconvenience, girl. Do you have any idea how much money I've lost because of your stubbornness?" "Good," Elena spat, surprised by the venom in her own voice. "I hope I cost you everything." Brave words from someone who was crying on an auction block 2 months ago. Crow's smile returned, cruel and confident. "But bravery doesn't change fact. You're mine, whether by debt or by force. The only question is how much trouble you want to cause first." "She's not yours," a new voice called out. "She's not anyone's." They all turned to see Thomas Wright riding up the path, followed by 6 other men from town. The blacksmith, the stable owner, 2 ranch hands Elena recognized from her father's store, even the minister despite his advanced age. Behind them came Mrs. Patterson and 3 other women, all armed with rifles held with varying degrees of competence. Caleb's surprise was evident. "Thomas, what—" "We heard Crow was riding out here," Thomas interrupted, dismounting and taking position beside Caleb. "Figured you might need some help." He looked at Crow with undisguised contempt. "See? Some of us have been tolerating your methods for too long, Silas, letting you buy up debts and squeeze people until they break. But selling people? That crossed a line." "This is a private business matter," Crow said, but Elena heard the first note of uncertainty in his voice. "Nothing about that auction was private," Mrs. Patterson called out. "Half the town watched you traffic a young girl like she was livestock. Some of us have been losing sleep over it ever since. The law is on my side, Crow insisted, but he was looking around now, counting heads, recalculating odds. Maybe it was, the minister said quietly. But I've been going through county records, Silas. Interesting things turn up when you look close. Debts that mysteriously triple overnight, signatures that don't quite match, property seized for taxes that were actually paid. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. The circuit judge will be very interested in these findings. Crow's face flushed dark red. You self-righteous hypocrites. You've been taking my money for years, buying goods I import, drinking in the saloon I own, sleeping easy while I did the dirty work of keeping this town profitable. But now you want to pretend you're better than me? We're not pretending to be better, Caleb said quietly. We're just trying to do better, starting today. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Elena's hand moved to the knife Caleb had given her, hidden in her skirt pocket. If violence erupted, she would fight. She wouldn't go back in chains, she'd die first. But Crow wasn't stupid. He saw the numbers shifting against him, saw the resolve in faces that had previously shown only submission and fear. He pulled his horse back a step, then another. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You think a few townspeople with rifles make a difference? I own the sheriff. I own the bank. I own most of the land you're standing on. You've just made yourselves my enemies, and I destroy my enemies. Then destroy us, Thomas said simply. But you're not taking Elena. Not today. Crow's eyes swept across the assembled group, landing finally on Elena. You think you've won something here? You think these people will protect you forever? They'll get tired, get distracted, go back to their comfortable lives. And when they do, I'll be waiting. 7 years of your life belong to me, girl. One way or another, I'll collect. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. But one of them, a scarred man Elena didn't recognize, lingered a moment, his eyes on Caleb's barn. Then he spurred his horse after the others, leaving only dust and the echo of threat behind. The moment they disappeared over the rise, Elena's knees buckled. Caleb caught her, his arm around her shoulders steady and strong. The townspeople gathered closer, offering words of support and solidarity that Elena barely heard through the rushing in her ears. Why? She finally managed, looking at Thomas and the others. Why did you come? Thomas looked uncomfortable. Because what happened to you was wrong. We all knew it was wrong when it was happening, but we didn't do anything. We just stood there and watched. He shook his head. I couldn't live with that anymore. None of us could. Mrs. Patterson dismounted and approached Elena, her weathered face kind. Child, I knew your mother. She was a good woman who deserved better than what life gave her, and you deserve better than being treated like property. If that means standing up to Silas Crow, then that's what we'll do. The minister cleared his throat. We're forming a committee to investigate Crow's business practices. With proper documentation and legal support, we might be able to break his hold on this town. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but the shot came from nowhere, splitting the afternoon air like thunder. The minister dropped, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading rapidly across his white shirt. Chaos erupted as everyone dove for cover, weapons drawn, searching for the shooter. The barn! Someone shouted. Elena saw him then. The scarred man who'd lingered, now emerging from behind Caleb's barn with a rifle raised. He'd circled back, used the distraction of Crow's departure to get into position. Now he took aim again, and this time his target was Caleb. Elena didn't think. She threw herself sideways, crashing into Caleb and taking them both to the ground as the bullet whistled through the space where his head had been. They hit the dirt hard, Elena's shoulder screaming with impact, but alive. Both of them alive. Return fire exploded from the townspeople, forcing the shooter to duck back behind the barn. Thomas and 2 others rushed forward, using the barn's blind spots to flank him. Elena heard shouting, the sound of a scuffle, then silence. Got him! Thomas called out. He's down! Caleb helped Elena to her feet, his hands shaking slightly as he checked her for injuries. Are you hurt? No, Elena gasped. Are you? No. Thanks to you. His eyes held something new, not just respect, but recognition. She wasn't the terrified girl from the auction block anymore. She'd just saved his life. The minister was being tended by Mrs. Patterson, who'd produced bandages and was working with practiced efficiency despite the blood. "It's not too bad," she announced. "Went clean through the shoulder. He'll be fine with rest and care." The scarred man lay unconscious near the barn, blood trickling from where Thomas had hit him with a rifle butt. They tied him up with rope from the barn, and someone rode off to fetch the sheriff, corrupted as he might be by Crow's influence. Attempted murder couldn't be ignored entirely. Elena found herself sitting on the porch steps, reaction setting in, her whole body trembling. Molly burst out of the house the moment Caleb unlocked the door and threw herself at him, sobbing. He scooped her up, holding her tight, while she cried out her fear. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everyone's okay. We're safe. I heard shots. I thought... Molly couldn't finish, just buried her face against her father's neck. "I know, but we're fine. Elena's fine. Everything's going to be all right." But Elena knew better. This was just the beginning. Crow had drawn first blood, shown he was willing to escalate to violence and murder. The fragile safety of the ranch had been shattered, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Thomas approached, his expression grim. "We need to talk about what happens next. Crow won't let this go. He can't. Not without looking weak. And weak men in powerful positions do desperate things." They gathered in the house. Caleb, Elena, Thomas, Mrs. Patterson, the blacksmith whose name was Henderson, and two others. Molly was sent to her room with strict instructions to stay there, though Elena could hear the little girl crying softly through the walls. "We need to get Elena somewhere safe," Mrs. Patterson said. "Take her to another town, maybe another state, where Crow can't reach her." "Running doesn't solve the problem," Henderson argued. "Crow will just move on to his next victim. We need to stop him here and now." "How?" Thomas asked. "We don't have the law on our side. The sheriff's in his pocket. The judge won't arrive for another month. And Crow has enough money to buy his way out of anything short of witnessed murder." "We have the evidence," the minister said quietly, his voice strained with pain from his shoulder wound. "My records of his fraudulent practices. If we can get those to the territorial governor, bypass the local corruption entirely." "That takes time," Caleb interrupted. "Time we might not have. Crow knows we're organized now. He'll move fast, try to break us before we can solidify." They argued strategy while Elena sat silent, listening to these people who'd risked their lives defend someone most of them barely knew. The weight of their sacrifice pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. "Stop," she said finally, her voice cutting through the debate. Everyone turned to look at her. "Stop planning my life like I'm not here. Stop deciding what I should do, where I should go. I'm done being passive." "Elena," Caleb started. "No, listen to me. All of you." She stood, facing them with a strength that surprised even herself. "You came here today because you were tired of letting fear dictate your choices. Because you decided that standing up was worth the risk. I need to do the same." "What are you saying?" Thomas asked. "I'm saying I won't run. I won't hide. And I won't let Crow use me to control this town anymore." Elena's voice grew stronger with each word. "He wants me terrified, wants me to feel helpless so that everyone else stays helpless too. But I'm not that girl anymore. I refuse to be." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "Child, you don't understand the danger. I understand perfectly. I've lived the danger. I've stood in chains while men bid on me like cattle. I've been told I'm property, that my life belongs to someone else. And I'm telling you right now, I'd rather die free than live as anyone's possession." Elena met Caleb's eyes. "You taught me to shoot. You taught me to fight. Now let me use those lessons." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, but not alone. We do this together or not at all." They talked late into the night, formulating a plan that was equal parts desperate and bold. The minister would send his evidence to the territorial capital with a trusted courier. Thomas would organize the townspeople into watches, making sure Crow couldn't attack without witnesses. Henderson would reach out to neighboring towns, spreading word of Crow's practices and building a coalition too large to intimidate. And Elena would testify. When the circuit judge arrived in 3 weeks, she would stand in front of the town and tell her story. The debt that wasn't hers, the auction that was illegal, the threats and violence that followed. She would put her experience into the public record where it couldn't be erased or rewritten. It won't be easy, Caleb warned as the others finally left and they were alone again. Testifying means reliving everything. It means being questioned, challenged, having your character attacked. I know, Elena said, but it's not just about me anymore. It's about the next girl Crow tries to sell, the next family he destroys. Someone has to say enough. It might as well be me. Molly had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by fear and tears. Caleb checked on her, then returned to find Elena standing at the window, staring out at the prairie darkness. You saved my life today, he said quietly. You saved mine first, Elena replied. On that auction block. You saved my life, Caleb. Now I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. You could still leave. Take a horse tonight. Ride to the next territory. Start over somewhere Crow's reach doesn't extend. Elena shook her head. I spent my whole life running from one crisis to the next. Running from my father's debts, from my mother's death, from the reality that the world is often cruel and unjust. I'm done running. She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, Caleb saw the girl from the auction platform transformed. She stood straighter now, met his eyes without flinching, wore her scars like badges of survival rather than marks of shame. Whatever happens next, Elena said, I'm going to face it standing up, not in chains, not in fear, standing. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy and preparation. Life on the ranch continued. Animals needed feeding, crops required tending. Molly still needed stories and laughter, and the routines that made childhood secure. But underneath the normalcy ran currents of tension and vigilance. Townspeople came and went, coordinating watches and sharing information. Crow made no direct moves, but his presence was felt in small ways. Supplies ordered but not delivered, credit suddenly called due. Workers offered better wages to abandon their current employers. He was testing them, seeing who would break first under pressure. Elena practiced her testimony with Caleb, forcing herself to speak the truth of what had happened without breaking down. Each retelling was its own trauma, ripping open wounds that had barely begun to heal. But it grew easier, and with ease came power. Her story couldn't be taken from her. No matter what Crow did, he couldn't erase what had happened or silence her voice unless he killed her. And if he tried that, well, she'd learned to shoot. Molly sensed the tension but handled it with the resilience of childhood. She stayed close to Elena, as if proximity might protect them both. They worked in the garden together, read stories on the porch, baked bread in the kitchen. Simple activities that anchored them to the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around fear. Elena? Molly asked one evening as they shelled peas for dinner. Are you going to stay with us forever? Elena's hand stilled. I don't know, sweetheart. Forever is a long time. But you want to stay? At least for a while? Yes, Elena admitted. I want to stay. Molly nodded, satisfied. Good, because I love you. And I don't want you to go away like Mama did. The simple declaration nearly undid Elena completely. She pulled the little girl into a hug, holding her tight. I love you too, Molly. Whatever happens, that's true. The night before the judge's arrival, Elena couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch in the darkness, wrapped in the same blanket Caleb had given her that first day. So much had changed since then. She'd been a girl in chains, broken and terrified. Now she was, what? A woman finding her strength? A survivor learning to live rather than merely endure? Caleb joined her, settling onto the porch steps with a quiet sigh. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the prairie night sounds, crickets and owls, and the distant howl of coyotes. Whatever happens tomorrow, Caleb said finally, you should know that these past few months have meant something. You being here, healing, becoming yourself again. It's reminded me that life can be more than just survival. Elena looked at him, seeing the loneliness he carried, the grief he'd learned to live with but never quite overcome. What was she like? Rachel? Caleb was quiet for so long Elena thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and rich with memory. He told her about a woman who laughed easily and loved fiercely, who could gentle a wild horse and speak 3 languages, who died too young and taken a piece of him with her. Some days I can barely remember her face, he admitted. That terrifies me more than anything, that I might forget the most important person I've ever known. You won't forget, Elena said with certainty, because she's in Molly. And the way your daughter is kind and brave and sees good in the world, that's Rachel's legacy. Caleb's eyes glistened in the moonlight. Thank you for that. They sat together until dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Two people damaged by loss, held together by choice rather than obligation. And when the sun finally rose, Elena stood to face it, ready for whatever the day would bring. The courthouse was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. News of the hearing had spread through the territory, drawing curious onlookers and genuine supporters in equal measure. Elena sat in the front row between Caleb and Mrs. Patterson, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Judge Morrison was a severe-looking man in his 60s, his face weathered and his eyes sharp. He listened to the opening arguments with careful attention, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. Silas Crow sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a slick man from the territorial capital who oozed confidence and contempt. Crow met Elena's eyes once and smiled, a predator's smile that promised consequences regardless of the day's outcome. Elena was called to testify first. She walked to the witness stand on legs that threatened to buckle, aware of every eye on her, every whisper that followed her movement. But she kept her chin up, kept walking, and when she placed her hand on the Bible to swear her oath, her voice didn't shake. She told her story simply and clearly, her father's debts, the men who came to take her, the chains and the auction block, Caleb's intervention and the threats that followed. She didn't cry, didn't embellish, just laid out the facts like stones building a wall between her past and her future. Crow's lawyer cross-examined her viciously, trying to paint her as a liar, a troublemaker, a girl who'd consented to the arrangement and now regretted it. He insinuated things about her character that made Elena's face burn with shame and anger. But she held her ground, meeting each accusation with calm denial. Did you or did you not sign papers agreeing to work off your father's debt? The lawyer demanded. I never signed anything, Elena said firmly. I was taken from my home without warning and sold at auction 2 days later. There were no papers, no agreements, no consent. And yet you expect this court to believe that a respected businessman like Mr. Crow would engage in human trafficking? I expect this court to look at the evidence, Elena replied, to question why a debt auction would require chains, why a girl would be sold to the highest bidder if it was merely about labor, why threats and violence followed when I was given sanctuary. The testimony continued for hours. Other witnesses were called, Thomas, Mrs. Patterson, the minister despite his injured shoulder. They corroborated Elena's story, added their own observations, painted a picture of systematic abuse of power that made even the judge's stern expression falter. Then Crow took the stand, all righteous indignation and injured dignity. He spoke of legal debts and proper procedures, of a community ungrateful for his economic contributions, of a troublesome girl causing problems where none existed. His lawyer presented documents, carefully falsified, Elena was certain, that seemed to support his version of events. The hearing stretched into evening. Finally, Judge Morrison called a recess until the following morning for his deliberation. Elena walked out of the courthouse feeling hollowed out, every emotion scraped raw. Caleb's hand on her shoulder was the only thing keeping her upright. You did well, he murmured. Whatever happens, you told the truth. That matters. But as they walked to the wagon, Elena saw Crow watching her from across the street. His expression promised that truth might not be enough, that power and money could rewrite reality itself. And she wondered if all her courage, all her testimony, would amount to anything against a man who owned half the territory. That night, back at the ranch, Elena couldn't eat. She sat with Molly instead, reading stories until the little girl fell asleep. Then she joined Caleb on the porch, both of them too restless for sleep. What if he wins? Elena whispered into the darkness. Then we appeal, Caleb said. We take it to a higher court. We fight harder. We don't give up. He could kill us. All of us. You saw what he tried before. He could try. Caleb's voice was steady. But we're not alone anymore. The whole town stood with us today. That's not nothing, Elena. That's everything. They sat together through another night, drawing strength from proximity, waiting for dawn and whatever verdict it might bring. And somewhere in that darkness, Elena realized that regardless of what the judge decided, she'd already won something important. She'd found her voice. She'd learned to fight. She'd discovered that she was worth fighting for. Whatever came next, she would face it standing. Not in chains, standing. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times, each chime echoing across the town like a countdown to judgment. Elena sat rigid in her seat, Caleb's hand resting protectively on the wooden bench between them. The courtroom had filled even earlier than yesterday, word having spread that Judge Morrison would deliver his ruling this morning. The air felt thick with anticipation and the smell of too many bodies packed into too small a space. Judge Morrison entered precisely on the final bell, his black robes making him look like a severe bird of prey. He carried a single sheet of paper, and Elena's entire future seemed condensed into whatever words were written there. Her heart hammered so hard she wondered if others could hear it. The judge settled into his chair, adjusted his spectacles, and surveyed the crowded room with an expression that gave nothing away. The silence stretched so long Elena thought she might scream, just to break it. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented in the matter of Elena Moore versus Silas Crow, Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed space. This case raises questions not merely of debt and contract, but of fundamental human dignity and the limits of legal authority. Elena's fingernails dug into her palms. Beside her, she felt Caleb tense. Mr. Crow contends that Miss Moore's seizure and auction were legal remedies for unpaid family debt. He has presented documentation that appears, on surface examination, to support this claim. Morrison paused, and Elena's stomach dropped. However, upon closer scrutiny, several irregularities emerge. The judge lifted the paper, reading from it directly. First, the debt in question was incurred by Miss Moore's father, not by Miss Moore herself. Kansas territorial law does not permit the seizure of adult children for parental debts. Second, even if such seizure were legal, the manner of sale, public auction, with the girl in chains, sold to the highest bidder with no apparent restrictions on use, constitutes trafficking in human beings, which violates both territorial and federal law. Elena's breath caught. Crow's lawyer started to object, but Morrison silenced him with a sharp look. Third, and perhaps most damningly, the documents Mr. Crow presented claiming this was to be 7 years of indentured servitude were dated 3 days after the original auction. This suggests they were created retroactively to provide legal cover for an illegal transaction. Morrison's voice hardened. I don't look kindly on fraud in my courtroom, Mr. Crow. Crow's face had gone from confident to pale, but his lawyer recovered quickly. Your Honor, if there were administrative errors in documentation, administrative errors? Morrison's eyebrows rose. That's an interesting characterization of what appears to be deliberate falsification of legal documents. He set the paper down with deliberate care. Here is my ruling. The seizure and auction of Elena Moore were illegal. Any claim Mr. Crow had on her person or her labor is hereby nullified. Furthermore, I am ordering the return of the $175 paid by Mr. Caleb Rowan, plus an additional $300 in compensatory damages to Miss Moore for the trauma and injury she suffered. The courtroom erupted. Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. Free. She was free. Actually, legally free. Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order! I'm not finished. The room quieted reluctantly. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation of Mr. Crow's business practices. If fraud is found in other transactions, additional charges may follow. This is outrageous. Crow was on his feet, his composure finally cracking. You can't. I can, and I have. Morrison's voice was cold. And Mr. Crow? If you interrupt these proceedings again, I will hold you in contempt. Sit down. Crow sat, but his eyes were pure venom as they fixed on Elena. The threat in that gaze was unmistakable. The judge might have freed her legally, but Crow would make her pay for this humiliation. Elena met his stare without flinching, drawing on every ounce of courage she'd developed over the past months. This court is adjourned. Morrison's gavel fell one final time. The room exploded into noise and movement. People surged forward to congratulate Elena, to shake Caleb's hand, to celebrate a victory that felt larger than just one girl's freedom. Elena found herself pulled into Mrs. Patterson's embrace, then Thomas's, then a dozen others. Their joy and relief washed over her like a wave. But underneath she felt strangely numb, as if her body hadn't quite caught up to what her mind knew was true. Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued. Someone had brought whiskey, someone else produced a fiddle, and within minutes an impromptu party had formed on the courthouse steps. Elena stood slightly apart, watching these people who'd become allies, friends, family in the space of a few short months. They'd risked everything for her, and they'd won. "How does it feel?" Caleb asked quietly, appearing at her elbow with Molly clinging to his leg. "I don't know yet," Elena admitted. "Strange, like I'm waiting for someone to take it back." "No one can take it back. It's done. You're free." Free. The word should have brought joy, but instead it brought uncertainty. Free to do what? Free to go where? For months, Elena's entire existence had been defined by survival, by fighting against Crow's claim on her. Now that the fight was won, she didn't know what came next. Molly tugged on Elena's skirt, her small face serious. "Does this mean you have to leave now? Now that the judge said you can go anywhere?" The question struck Elena like a physical blow. In the chaos of the trial and the relief of victory, she hadn't considered what freedom actually meant. She could leave. Could start over somewhere Crow's influence didn't reach, somewhere no one knew her as the girl who'd been sold at auction. She could become anyone, do anything, build a life that had nothing to do with chains or trauma or fear. But looking down at Molly's worried face, at Caleb's carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide his hope, Elena realized that leaving was the last thing she wanted. "I don't have to go anywhere," Elena said, crouching down to Molly's level. "Unless you want me to." "No." Molly threw her arms around Elena's neck with such force they both nearly toppled over. "I want you to stay forever and ever." "Forever is a long time," Elena said, echoing the conversation they'd had weeks ago. "But I can do for a while, if your father agrees." She looked up at Caleb, suddenly uncertain. Everything had been crisis and survival mode. They'd never discussed what would happen after, what Elena's place in their lives might be once the immediate danger passed. Maybe he'd only offered sanctuary because it was needed. Maybe now that she was legally free and safe, he expected her to move on. But Caleb's expression softened into something warm and genuine. "I'd like you to stay. Both of us would. For as long as you want. Not as a debt or an obligation, as family." Family. The word settled into Elena's chest like a key turning in a lock, opening something she'd thought permanently closed. She'd lost her family, mother to death, father to cowardice and debt, and thought herself permanently alone. But here was a new family, chosen rather than born into, built on respect and kindness rather than blood. "Then I'll stay," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "For a while at least, until I figure out what I want to do next." The party continued around them, but Caleb suggested they head home before it got too rowdy. They collected the wagon and started the familiar journey back to the ranch, Molly chattering excitedly about the trial and the judge, and how Elena was now free as a bird and could fly anywhere she wanted, but please don't actually fly away. As they crested the rise that brought the ranch into view, Elena felt something shift inside her. This place, these simple buildings on an endless prairie, had become more than just shelter. It had become sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where she could heal, could grow, could become herself again. But peace was short-lived. 3 days after the trial, Elena was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard riders approaching. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt. Caleb insisted she carry one always now, and she moved to the window. 5 riders, but not Crow's men. These wore badges. The territorial marshal and his deputies. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. Elena watched through the window as he spoke with the marshal, their conversation too distant to hear. After several minutes, Caleb gestured toward the house and the marshal nodded. They entered together, the marshal removing his hat respectfully. He was an older man with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much. "Miss Moore," he said with a slight nod. "I'm Marshal Hendricks. I'm here about Silas Crow." Elena's heart jumped into her throat. "What about him?" "He's disappeared. Left town the night after the trial, took what money he could carry and vanished. Left behind a considerable mess of fraudulent debts and angry creditors. Hendricks pulled out a small notebook. We're investigating his affairs, and we found evidence of similar schemes in 3 other towns. You weren't the first girl he tried to sell, Miss Moore, just the first one who fought back successfully. The information hit Elena like a punch to the stomach. Other girls. Other families destroyed. And she'd been lucky. Found someone willing to intervene, to fight, to stand up. How many others hadn't been so fortunate? Are you looking for them? She asked urgently. The other girls? We're trying. Some trail went cold years ago. Others... Hendricks shook his head grimly. Let's just say they didn't end up in situations as fortunate as yours. Elena sank into a chair, the weight of what could have been crushing down on her. If Caleb hadn't stepped forward at that auction, if the townspeople hadn't rallied, if the judge hadn't been honest, she could have disappeared like those other girls, lost to systems that valued profit over humanity. Miss Moore, I need to ask, do you feel safe here? Hendricks' question was direct, his gaze sharp. Crow may be gone, but he has associates, people who might seek revenge for his downfall. She's safe, Caleb said firmly before Elena could answer. I'll make sure of that. I'm safe, Elena confirmed, finding her voice. And I can protect myself if needed. Hendricks studied her for a moment, then nodded with what looked like approval. I believe you can, but stay vigilant. Men like Crow don't forget grudges, and they rarely stay gone forever. After the marshal left, Elena sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling with reaction. Crow was gone, but not captured. Out there somewhere, nursing his wounded pride and planning who knew what. The victory suddenly felt hollow, incomplete. Elena. Caleb sat across from her, his voice gentle. You can't carry the weight of everyone Crow hurt. You did what you could do. You testified. You stood up. You helped expose him. That's enough. But it's not, Elena protested. Those other girls are the marshal's responsibility now, not yours. Caleb reached across the table, covering her hand with his. You've been fighting for months, always in survival mode, always looking over your shoulder. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and start living. I don't know how to do that, Elena admitted. I don't know how to just be, without the threat hanging over me, without a battle to fight. I don't know who I am when I'm not running or fighting or terrified. Then maybe it's time to find out. Over the following weeks, Elena tried to take Caleb's advice. She threw herself into the rhythms of ranch life, finding peace in the daily tasks that had no drama, no stakes beyond whether the bread rose properly or the garden rows were straight enough. She helped Molly with her lessons, teaching her arithmetic and reading with a patience that surprised them both. One afternoon, as they sat under the oak tree working through a particularly tricky word problem, Molly looked up at Elena with sudden seriousness. Elena, do you think you could be my mama? Not replace my real mama, because she'll always be my mama in heaven, but like a second mama? Elena's throat tightened. What brought this on, sweetheart? Sarah Miller at school said you're probably going to marry my daddy, and then you'd be my mama anyway. And I thought maybe we could skip the waiting part because I already love you, and you already live here, and it seems silly to wait for grown-up stuff when we already know what we want. The child's logic was so straightforward, so innocent of the complications that defined adult relationships. Elena didn't know how to explain that she and Caleb had never discussed anything beyond her staying temporarily, that marriage would require feelings neither of them had acknowledged, that becoming someone's mother was terrifying even when you desperately wanted it. Your daddy and I are friends, Elena said carefully. Good friends who care about each other, but marriage is complicated and... Do you love him? Molly interrupted with characteristic directness. Elena opened her mouth to deflect, to give some diplomatic non-answer that would satisfy a child's curiosity without revealing too much. But looking into Molly's open, trusting face, she found she couldn't lie. I think I might, she whispered, the admission terrifying and liberating simultaneously. But love isn't always enough for marriage, and there are other things to consider. Like what? Molly demanded. Daddy's lonely, even though he pretends he's not. You're sad sometimes, even though you're getting happier. You both like books and coffee and watching the sunset. You make him smile the way he used to smile in pictures with my real mama. That seems like enough things to me. Out of the mouths of babes, Elena thought. When had the world become so complicated that a child could see truth more clearly than adults? That evening, after Molly had gone to bed, Elena found Caleb on the porch, as had become their habit. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Molly asked me if I would be her mother today, Elena said finally. Caleb went very still. What did you tell her? I told her that you and I were friends, that marriage was complicated. Elena paused, gathering courage. But the truth is, I'm not sure what we are, Caleb. These past months, everything has been crisis and survival. We haven't had time to figure out what we might be to each other when we're not fighting for our lives. What do you want us to be? Caleb asked quietly. It was the same question he'd asked months ago. What did she want? Only now, the answer had changed. Or maybe it had always been there, just buried under layers of trauma and fear. I want a life, Elena said slowly. Not just survival, but actual life. I want to wake up without checking over my shoulder. I want to plan for next year without wondering if I'll live that long. I want... She took a breath. I want what we've been building here. You and me and Molly. This family that somehow formed when none of us were paying attention. Caleb turned to look at her, and in the lamplight spilling from the window, Elena saw something tender and uncertain in his expression. I loved my wife, he said. I still love her, in the way you love someone who shaped who you are. But she's gone, and I'm still here, still living. And somewhere along the way, you became part of that life. Not a replacement for Rachel. No one could replace her. But something new. Something that feels right in a different way. Is this a proposal? Elena asked, her heart racing. No. Caleb's answer was immediate, and Elena felt disappointment crash through her until he continued. Because you deserve better than a proposal born from convenience or gratitude or the fact that Molly asked you to be her mother. When I ask you to marry me, if I ask you, it will be because we both know that's what we want. Not because circumstances pushed us together, but because we're choosing each other deliberately. And are we there yet? Elena whispered. At that choice? I don't know, Caleb admitted. Are you? Can you look at this ranch, at this life, at me and my daughter, and know with certainty that this is what you want? Not just for now, but for the long term. Elena considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a girl in chains with no future beyond whatever her buyer decided. Now she was a woman who'd testified in court, who'd learned to shoot and fight, who'd found strength she didn't know she possessed. She'd gone from having no choices to having infinite possibilities. And out of all those possibilities, the one that called to her most strongly was the simplest. Staying here with these people who'd become her family, building a life that was quiet and good and hers. Ask me again in spring, she said finally, when we've had time to just live together without crisis, when we know each other as people, not just as allies in survival. And if you still want to ask, and if I still want to hear it, then we'll know it's real. Caleb's smile was slow but genuine. Spring it is. They sat together until the night grew late, talking quietly about nothing important and everything essential. About Caleb's plans to expand the cattle herd, and Elena's vague idea that maybe she could teach, could help other children the way she'd been helping Molly. About the past that had shaped them and the future that felt, for the first time, like something they could actually have. The next morning, Elena woke with unusual clarity about what she wanted to do. She found Caleb in the barn, brushing down his horse. I want to start a school, she announced without preamble. Caleb paused mid-brushstroke. A school? A small one, for children from the outlying ranches who can't make it to town regularly, and for girls especially, girls who might otherwise fall through the cracks the way I almost did. Elena's words came faster, enthusiasm building. I could teach reading, writing, arithmetic, basic skills that give children options beyond whatever circumstances they're born into. That's a big undertaking, Caleb said carefully. Do you have any idea where you'd hold classes? How you'd get students? Who would pay for supplies? I thought... Elena hesitated. I thought maybe here? There's that old shed you're not using. We could clean it out, add some benches and a blackboard. As for students, Mrs. Patterson has been saying her grandchildren need schooling, and the Henderson kids and the Wrights. They're all within riding distance. Caleb set down his brush, giving her his full attention. You've really thought about this. I have. I need something that's mine, Caleb. Something I'm building, not just something I survived. And teaching feels right. It feels like taking everything horrible that happened and turning it into something good. She met his eyes. What do you think? I think, Caleb said slowly, that you'd be an excellent teacher. And I think that shed could be converted pretty easily. And I think the town would probably help given what you've been through and what you're trying to do. Really? Hope bloomed in Elena's chest. Really? Let's talk to people this Sunday after church. See who's interested, what kind of help we can get. Sunday came, and with it a groundswell of support that surprised even Elena. Mrs. Patterson immediately pledged her grandchildren and offered to help with supplies. The minister, arm still in a sling from the shooting, donated books from the church library. Henderson volunteered his labor to help convert the shed. Thomas Wright's wife, a former teacher herself, offered to help with curriculum planning. Within 2 weeks, work had begun on what would become Elena's schoolhouse. It was modest, barely more than a large room with a few windows, but it was hers. She spent hours planning lessons, organizing the donated books, creating a space where children could learn and grow and discover that education was a form of freedom all its own. Molly was her constant shadow during the preparations, asking endless questions and offering suggestions that ranged from brilliant to absurd. Elena loved every minute of it, loved seeing the world through a child's eyes, loved the way Molly trusted her implicitly. When you start teaching the other kids, will you still have time for me? Molly asked one afternoon as they painted the schoolhouse walls white. Always, Elena promised. You're not just my student, Molly. You're my family. That doesn't change. Even if you teach 100 other kids? Even if I teach 1,000 other kids? Satisfied, Molly returned to her painting with renewed enthusiasm, leaving small white handprints on everything she touched. The schoolhouse was completed in early November, just as the weather began to turn cold. Elena stood in the doorway, surveying the neat rows of benches, the blackboard Henderson had installed, the small stove that would keep them warm through winter. It wasn't much, but it represented something profound. Her choice, her future, her contribution to a community that had saved her. Her first day of teaching arrived with both excitement and terror. 6 students showed up that first morning, ranging in age from 5 to 13, all children from nearby ranches whose parents worked too hard to manage education themselves. Elena stood before them, suddenly terrified that she had no idea what she was doing, that she'd fail these children who were depending on her. Then Molly raised her hand. Miss Elena, can we start with reading? I want to show everyone how good I've gotten. And just like that, Elena relaxed. This wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, trying her best, and giving these children the tools they'd need to build better lives. She could do that. She had learned to do much harder things. The weeks passed quickly, each day bringing new challenges and small victories. Teaching turned out to be harder than Elena had anticipated, but also more rewarding. When young Timothy Henderson finally understood long division after weeks of struggle, his face lit up with such joy that Elena nearly cried. When Sarah Wright read an entire page without help, Elena felt prouder than if she'd accomplished some great feat herself. The students adored her, perhaps sensing that she understood struggle and hardship in ways most adults wouldn't acknowledge. She was patient with their mistakes, encouraging with their efforts, and honest about her own limitations. Sometimes she didn't know the answer to their questions and had to research it herself, showing them that learning was a lifelong journey, not a destination. Caleb watched this transformation with quiet amazement. The terrified girl from the auction platform had become a confident woman who commanded a classroom with natural authority. She'd found her purpose, her calling, and in doing so had completed the healing that safety and time alone couldn't accomplish. One evening in late December, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Elena sat at the kitchen table grading papers while Caleb carved a wooden toy for Molly's Christmas present. The domesticity of the scene struck Elena suddenly. This was her life now. Not running, not surviving, but actually living. building a future one small moment at a time. I've been thinking, Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. Spring is only a few months away. Elena's hand stilled on the paper she was marking. They hadn't discussed his statement from months ago, hadn't revisited the question of what they were becoming to each other, but it had hung between them, a promise and a question rolled into one. It is, Elena agreed carefully, and I find myself more certain every day that this life we're building, is exactly what I want. Not because circumstances forced it, not because it's convenient, but because you make this house feel like a home again. Because watching you with Molly reminds me that family is about choice as much as blood. Because I look forward to every evening we spend talking. Every morning I wake up knowing you're here. Elena's eyes burned with tears. Caleb, I'm not asking yet, he interrupted gently. I promised spring, and I keep my promises. But I wanted you to know where my heart is heading, so that when spring comes, you'll know the question is real and the choice is yours without pressure or obligation. My choice, Elena repeated softly, the phrase that had defined her journey, from no choices at all to infinite possibilities, and finally to choosing this man, this child, this life, because it was what she wanted more than anything else she could imagine. Always your choice, Caleb confirmed. Winter settled over the prairie, bringing with it cold winds and early darkness. But inside the small ranch house, warmth prevailed. Elena taught her students during the day and spent evenings with her chosen family. And slowly, quietly, the last pieces of her broken heart knit themselves back together. She was healing. Not just surviving, but actually healing. And in that healing, she was becoming someone new, someone stronger and kinder and braver than the girl who'd stood in chains months ago. That girl had been a victim. This woman was a survivor. And more than that, she was someone who'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. On Christmas Eve, they sat together by the fire, Caleb, Elena, and Molly, who'd finally fallen asleep after hours of excitement. Snow fell softly outside, covering the prairie in pristine white. Thank you, Elena said quietly. For what? Caleb asked. For seeing me as human when everyone else saw property. For giving me time to heal. For not asking for anything in return. She smiled. For everything, really. Thank you for staying, Caleb replied. For choosing us when you could have chosen anywhere, anything. For making this house a home again. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, content in the knowledge that they had time. Time to heal, time to grow, time to become whatever they were meant to be to each other. And outside, the snow continued falling, covering the past in white and promising a fresh start come spring. Spring arrived tentatively that year, winter reluctant to release its hold on the Kansas prairie. March brought alternating days of sunshine and snow flurries, as if the seasons themselves couldn't decide which would prevail. Elena watched the slow transformation from the schoolhouse window between lessons, noting how the brown grass gradually revealed hints of green, how the cottonwood trees began budding despite the lingering cold. She'd been teaching for 4 months now, and her small school had grown from 6 students to 12. Word had spread through the territory about the young woman who'd survived Silas Crow's cruelty and transformed her trauma into purpose. Parents rode for hours to bring their children to her classes, trusting her not just with education, but with the kind of nurturing care that came from someone who understood how fragile childhood could be. Miss Elena, you're not paying attention, young Timothy Henderson announced with the bluntness of an 8-year-old. I asked you 3 times if Missouri is spelled with 1 S or 2. Elena smiled, refocusing on her student. 2. 1 in the middle, 1 at the end. Try writing it 5 times so your hand remembers. The morning progressed through reading, arithmetic, and a geography lesson about the Western territories that had the students debating whether they'd rather live in the mountains or by the ocean. Elena let the discussion run longer than planned, valuing their engagement over strict adherence to schedule. These children spent most of their lives working on isolated ranches. The chance to share ideas and perspectives was as valuable as any formal lesson. When school dismissed at noon, ranch children had afternoon chores waiting. Elena stayed behind to tidy up and prepare for the next day. She was erasing the blackboard when she heard a horse approaching. Through the window, she recognized Marshal Hendricks dismounting. Her stomach clenched with old fear. The marshal's last visit had been about Crow's disappearance. Had they found him? Was he coming back? Elena's hand moved instinctively to the knife she still carried, Caleb's training never forgotten. But Hendrick's expression was neutral as he entered, removing his hat respectfully. Miss Moore, hope I'm not interrupting. School just ended. What can I do for you, Marshal? Wanted to update you on the Crow situation. Hendricks pulled out his ever-present notebook. We found him, or rather, found what's left of his operation. Elena's breath caught. Is he arrested? He's dead. Got himself killed in a gambling dispute down in Oklahoma Territory about 6 weeks ago. Owed money to the wrong people, and they settled the debt permanently. Hendrick's expression suggested he wasn't particularly sorry about this outcome. Means you can stop looking over your shoulder, Miss Moore. The man who tried to claim you is gone for good. The news should have brought relief, but instead, Elena felt oddly hollow. All those months of fear, of vigilance, of wondering when Crow might return, and he'd simply died in some nameless town over cards and money. There was no justice in it, no closure, just an ending as ugly and meaningless as the life he'd lived. What about the others? Elena asked quietly. The other girls he sold? We've tracked down 3 so far. 2 are in situations similar to yours, found people willing to stand up for them. The third, Hendricks shook his head. Didn't make it. Died 2 years ago, circumstances unclear. There are probably others we haven't found yet. Elena sank into one of the student benches, the weight of those words crushing. A girl had died, anonymous and forgotten, trapped in whatever hell Crow had sold her into. It could have been her. Would have been her if not for Caleb's intervention and the community's support. I'm sorry I don't have better news, Hendricks said gently, but I thought you deserved to know. Crow can't hurt anyone anymore. That's something, at least. After he left, Elena sat alone in the schoolhouse for a long time, processing the complicated grief of learning your tormentor is dead. She should feel relieved, triumphant even. Instead, she felt the profound sadness of wasted lives, Crow's victims who'd suffered, the man himself who'd chosen cruelty over humanity, the ripples of pain spreading outward from his actions. She was still sitting there when Caleb found her an hour later, Molly in tow. Elena? Marshall said he stopped by. Are you all right? Elena looked up at this man who'd saved her life in every way that mattered. Crow's dead. Killed in Oklahoma 6 weeks ago. Caleb absorbed this information with visible relief. That's good news, isn't it? I don't know what it is, Elena admitted. I thought I'd feel different when he was gone. Safer, maybe, or vindicated. But I just feel sad. For everyone he hurt, for the time we all spent being afraid, for the fact that he died without ever being held accountable. Caleb sat beside her on the small bench, his presence solid and comforting. You can feel sad and relieved at the same time. The world's complicated like that. Can we go home? Molly asked, her voice small. She'd been unusually quiet, picking up on the adult tension even if she didn't fully understand it. Yes, sweetheart. Let's go home. The words settled over Elena like a warm blanket. Home. The ranch wasn't just a place she stayed anymore. It was home in all the ways that mattered. She'd found belonging in this small corner of the world with these people who'd chosen to love her. That evening, after Molly had gone to bed, Elena and Caleb sat on the porch as had become their ritual. The night was warmer than it had been, spring finally asserting itself. The smell of thawing earth and new growth filled the air, that distinctive scent of the world waking up. It's almost April, Caleb said quietly. It is, Elena agreed, her heart beginning to race. Spring. He'd said spring. I've been thinking about that conversation we had back in December, about waiting until spring to know what we wanted. And what do you want? Elena's voice came out barely above a whisper. Caleb turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight spilling through the window, Elena saw certainty in his expression. No doubt, no hesitation, just quiet conviction. I want you, he said simply. Not as a guest, not as Molly's teacher, but as my wife. As a partner in this life we're building. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here, not because circumstances trapped you, but because you chose to stay. I want to build a future that's ours together, expanding the ranch, growing your school, Raising Molly, and maybe if you want more children someday. I want all of it, Elena. With you. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than pain. 6 months ago, she'd been a girl with no future, sold like property, certain she'd never know safety or love again. And now this man, this good, kind, steady man, was offering her everything she'd been afraid to hope for. Yes, she whispered, then louder, more certain. Yes, I want that too. All of it. Caleb's smile transformed his face, revealing a joy Elena had only glimpsed in fleeting moments before. He stood, pulling her to her feet, and for a moment they just looked at each other, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were choosing. Then Caleb cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her. It was gentle and tender and full of promise, a first kiss that felt like a beginning and a homecoming all at once. Elena leaned into him, letting herself believe that this happiness was real and lasting and hers to keep. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We should probably tell Molly. She's been asking me every day when I was going to propose. Elena laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. She asked me months ago if I could be her mother. I think she'll approve. They told Molly the next morning over breakfast. The little girl shrieked with delight, abandoned her eggs, and launched herself at Elena with such force they both nearly toppled over. I knew it! I knew you'd get married. Sarah Miller said it wouldn't happen, but I knew she was wrong. Molly's words tumbled over each other in her excitement. Can I be in the wedding? Can I wear a fancy dress? Can we have cake? When is it? Can it be soon? Slow down, sweetheart, Caleb said, laughing. We haven't planned anything yet. But we will, Elena added, hugging Molly tight. And yes, you'll absolutely be part of it. The most important part, actually. They decided on a small ceremony in late May, giving them time to prepare without waiting so long that anticipation turned into anxiety. The planning consumed the household in the best possible way. Molly drew elaborate pictures of what Elena's dress should look like, most featuring impractical numbers of flowers and ribbons. Mrs. Patterson immediately volunteered to help with the dress itself, recruiting 3 other women to assist with the sewing. The community rallied around the upcoming wedding with the same enthusiasm they'd shown during the trial. It felt less like preparing for one couple's marriage and more like the whole town celebrating their collective victory over cruelty and injustice. Elena had become a symbol of resilience, and her happiness felt like a promise that good could triumph over evil, that survival could transform into thriving. But preparation wasn't without its complicated moments. One afternoon, as Mrs. Patterson pinned the hem of Elena's wedding dress, the older woman said quietly, Your mother would have been so proud of you, child, of the woman you've become, of the life you're building. The unexpected mention of her mother hit Elena harder than she'd anticipated. She'd spent so long focused on survival, on building a future, that she hadn't properly mourned the woman who'd taught her to read and laugh and see beauty in small things. The woman who'd died never knowing if her daughter would be all right. I wish she could be here, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. She is, in her own way. Mrs. Patterson's hand stilled on the fabric. She's in your kindness, in the way you teach those children, in the strength that let you survive what should have broken you. That's her legacy, Elena. She lives on in you. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She let herself cry properly for the first time since her mother's death, grieving not just the loss, but all the moments her mother would miss. This wedding, future grandchildren, the simple joy of seeing her daughter happy and safe. Mrs. Patterson held her through the tears, offering the maternal comfort Elena hadn't known she desperately needed. When Elena finally composed herself, the older woman cupped her face gently. You're going to be a beautiful bride. And more importantly, you're going to be a wonderful wife and mother. Don't let anyone, not your past, not your fears, not even your own doubts, convince you otherwise. The weeks rushed by in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Elena continued teaching, finding that her upcoming marriage somehow made her students even more enthusiastic. They made her cards and small gifts, their families bringing contributions to the wedding celebration. The whole community seemed invested in this union, understanding that it represented something larger than just 2 people committing to each other. Marshal Hendricks returned one more time before the wedding, this time with official papers. The territorial government is formally dismissing all claims related to your father's debts, he explained. With Crow dead and evidence of fraud throughout his operations, they've decided to void all associated contracts. You're free, Miss Moore. Legally, officially, completely free. Elena took the papers with shaking hands. Official documents declaring her personhood, her autonomy, her right to choose her own future. She'd been living freely for months now, but having it acknowledged by legal authority felt like a final closing of a terrible chapter. Thank you, Marshal, for everything you did. You did the hard part, Hendricks replied. Standing up, testifying, refusing to be a victim. That took real courage. The rest of us just tried to catch up. The night before the wedding, Elena couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, the small room that had been her first safe haven, looking out at the prairie bathed in moonlight. Tomorrow, she would marry Caleb, would officially become Molly's mother, would commit to building a future in this place that had given her back her life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elena, can I come in? Molly's voice, tentative. Of course, sweetheart. Molly slipped into the room wearing her nightgown, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, vulnerable in the way children are when nighttime makes the world feel uncertain. Can't sleep? Elena guessed. I'm too excited, and also a little scared. Molly climbed onto the bed, tucking her feet under her. What if things change tomorrow? What if getting married makes everything different? Elena sat beside her, pulling the little girl close. Things will change. That's kind of the point. But different doesn't mean bad. It just means we're growing into something new. Will you still read to me and help with my lessons and make those funny faces when I'm sad? Every single day, Elena promised. Getting married to your father doesn't change how much I love you, Molly. It just makes it official. Good. Molly was quiet for a moment, then added softly, I still miss my real mama sometimes. Does that make you sad? No, sweetheart. It makes me understand how lucky she was to have you love her so much. Elena brushed hair back from Molly's face. I'm not trying to replace your mother. Nobody could. I'm just hoping to be someone who loves you just as much. In my own way. You already are, Molly said matter-of-factly. I knew it the first day you came here, when you were so sad and scared, but you still let me show you the chickens. I thought, this person is kind even when she's hurting. That's the best kind of person. Elena held Molly tighter, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of childhood. They sat together until Molly's breathing deepened and she fell asleep. Elena carefully carried her back to her own room, tucking her in with a tenderness that felt like practice for all the future moments of motherhood ahead. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect spring mornings that seemed designed for new beginnings. Elena woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. Mrs. Patterson arrived at sunrise with 3 other women, all of them bustling with preparations and advice. They dressed Elena in the gown they'd spent weeks creating, simple white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, nothing fancy but elegant in its simplicity. Mrs. Patterson wove wildflowers into Elena's dark hair, the purple and yellow blooms making her look like something from a fairy tale. Oh, child, Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes glistening. You're absolutely lovely. Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror. The haunted girl from the auction platform had vanished entirely, replaced by a woman who radiated quiet joy and hard-won strength. The scars on her wrists were still visible beneath the lace cuffs, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, proof that she'd survived and become someone stronger. The ceremony was held in the small church where the minister whose shoulder had healed well enough to officiate. Every pew was packed, the community turning out to witness this union that felt like a celebration of survival as much as love. Elena walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away. But she didn't need one. She was giving herself, choosing this life deliberately and completely. Caleb stood at the altar looking both nervous and awestruck in his good suit. Beside him, Molly practically vibrated with excitement in her new dress, clutching a basket of flower petals she'd been entrusted to scatter. As Elena reached them, Molly whispered loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, I told you she looked like a princess. Laughter rippled through the congregation, breaking any lingering tension. The minister smiled and began the ceremony, his voice rich with emotion as he spoke about love and commitment, about choosing to build a life together despite the hardships the world might bring. Marriage is an act of courage, he said, looking directly at Elena and Caleb. It's choosing to trust another person with your whole heart, knowing they could break it. It's promising to stand together through whatever storms come, to choose each other every day, even when choosing is hard. These two people have already weathered storms that would have destroyed others. Their commitment today is not naive or innocent, but rather the informed choice of two people who understand the value of what they're building. When it came time for vows, Caleb's voice was steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Elena, you came into my life when I'd forgotten how to hope for anything beyond just getting through each day. You reminded me that survival isn't enough, that we're meant for more than just enduring. I promise to honor your strength, to respect your independence, to support your dreams, and to love you with everything I have for all the days we're given. Elena's voice shook but held. Caleb, you saved my life, not just once, on that auction platform, but every day since. You taught me that kindness exists, that safety is possible, that I'm worth choosing. I promise to build this life with you, to be a partner in all things, to love your daughter as my own, and to never take for granted the gift of being chosen. The minister pronounced them married, and Caleb kissed her with gentle reverence, while Molly threw flower petals with wild enthusiasm, and the congregation erupted in applause. The celebration that followed was joyous chaos. Tables had been set up outside the church, laden with food contributed by families from across the territory. Someone produced a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and impromptu music filled the air. Children ran wild while adults talked and laughed, and toasted the new couple with homemade wine. Elena found herself passed from conversation to conversation, accepting congratulations and well wishes, watching Caleb do the same across the yard. Every few minutes, their eyes would meet across the crowd and they'd share a smile, a private acknowledgement of the magnitude of what they'd done. As the sun began setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Thomas Wright called for everyone's attention. I'd like to propose a toast, he announced, raising his glass. To Caleb and Elena Rowan, may their marriage be long and happy, and may they always remember that they're surrounded by a community that loves them and has their backs. To Caleb and Elena, the crowd echoed, glasses raised. Then Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. And to Elena specifically, you came to us broken and afraid, and you transformed that pain into purpose. Your school is changing lives. Your courage inspired this whole town to stand up to injustice, and your resilience reminds us all that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. We're honored to call you one of us. Elena's eyes filled with tears as the crowd raised their glasses again. These people who'd once stood silent at her auction had become her fiercest defenders, her family, her community. The transformation wasn't just in her, it was in all of them, a collective decision to be better than their fear. As the celebration wound down and people began heading home, Caleb found Elena standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching the last light fade from the sky. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. How are you feeling, Mrs. Rowan? Elena tested the name, rolling it around in her mind. Mrs. Rowan. A new identity, freely chosen, unmarked by trauma or fear. I feel happy, she said, surprised by the simplicity of it. Actually, genuinely happy. They returned to the ranch as a family, Caleb, Elena, and Molly, who'd finally exhausted herself and dozed in the back of the wagon. The house looked the same as when they'd left that morning, but somehow it felt different, more permanent, more real. After tucking Molly into bed, Elena and Caleb stood together in the main room, suddenly shy with each other despite months of easy companionship. The reality of being married, of sharing not just a house but a life, felt simultaneously natural and momentous. I never thought I'd have this, Elena said quietly. A home, a family, a future. 6 months ago, I couldn't imagine tomorrow, let alone a lifetime. And now? Caleb asked. Now I can imagine everything, years of teaching and watching Molly grow up, expanding the school, maybe having more children, growing old together on this prairie. She turned to face him fully. I can imagine a whole beautiful life, Caleb, and that's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Elena felt the last piece of her broken heart slot perfectly into place. She was whole again, not because someone had fixed her, but because she'd been given the time and space and support to fix herself. Spring turned into summer, and life settled into new rhythms. Elena's school grew to 16 students, necessitating an addition to the small building that the community helped construct. Molly thrived with the official designation of having Elena as her mother, introducing her proudly to anyone who'd listen. The ranch prospered under Caleb's careful management and Elena's contributions to the household economy through teaching fees. But the most profound change was internal. Elena no longer startled at sudden noises or checked over her shoulder constantly. She slept through the night without nightmares. She laughed easily and often, the sound no longer strange and unfamiliar. She'd learned to receive love without questioning its authenticity, to trust that safety could be permanent rather than temporary. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset, Molly announced, "I want a baby brother or sister." Elena and Caleb exchanged surprised glances. They'd discussed children in abstract terms, but hadn't made any concrete decisions. "That's a pretty big request, sweetheart," Caleb said carefully. "I know, but I've been thinking about it a lot." Molly's expression was serious. "Elena teaches all these other kids, and I think she'd be really good at having her own baby to teach. And I'd be a good big sister. I'd teach them everything I know." Elena pulled Molly onto her lap, heart swelling with love for this child who'd welcomed her so completely. "You would be an excellent big sister. But babies are complicated, and they don't happen just because we want them to." "But you do want one?" Molly persisted. "Someday?" Elena looked at Caleb, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Hope, uncertainty, the desire to build something new while honoring what had come before. "Someday," she agreed, "when the time is right." That night, after Molly had gone to bed, Elena and Caleb talked seriously about expanding their family. It was a conversation full of hope and hesitation, acknowledging Caleb's grief over losing his son while embracing the possibility of trying again, considering Elena's fears about pregnancy and childbirth while recognizing her desire for more children to love. "I want to wait a little longer," Elena said finally. "Give myself more time to just be settled, to fully believe that this happiness is real and lasting. Is that all right?" "More than all right," Caleb assured her. "We have time. There's no rush." As summer deepened, Elena's school became increasingly successful. Parents from 3 counties away began inquiring about enrollment. Mrs. Patterson suggested they might need to hire an additional teacher soon, maybe expand to year-round schooling instead of just spring and fall terms. "You've created something remarkable," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon as they watched the students during recess. "A place where children learn not just reading and arithmetic, but kindness and resilience. You're teaching them that survival can transform into thriving, that pain doesn't have to define us." "I'm just trying to give them what was given to me," Elena replied, "a chance to choose their own futures." On a clear September morning, Elena received a letter from the Territorial Education Board. Her hands shook as she opened it, scanning the formal language. Then she gasped. "What is it?" Caleb asked, looking up from repairing a bridle. "They want to officially recognize my school, give us funding, supplies, recognition as a certified educational institution." Elena's voice rose with excitement. "This means I can hire another teacher, expand the building, offer more classes. This means the school isn't just something I'm doing, it's something real and permanent." Caleb swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. "You did this. You took your pain and created something beautiful and important. I'm so proud of you, Elena." The celebration that evening included Molly dancing around the kitchen, making plans for what they could do with a bigger school. But later, after Molly had gone to bed, Elena found herself on the porch again, processing the magnitude of what had happened. She'd been nothing, property, a girl without value or future. And now she was a certified teacher with a recognized school, a respected member of the community, a woman building legacy and meaning. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she could barely recognize the terrified girl from the auction platform. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if Crow hadn't sold you?" Caleb asked quietly, joining her. If your father had managed to pay his debts, if none of this had happened? Elena considered the question seriously. Sometimes. I'd probably still be in that town, probably married to someone local, running my father's failing store into the ground. I'd be alive, but I don't know if I'd be living. She turned to look at him. What happened to me was horrible, but it also broke me open in ways that let me become someone I never could have been otherwise. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Caleb said. Tragedy doesn't justify itself, but sometimes it transforms us in unexpected ways. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and russets, Elena stood before her expanded school on opening day of the new term. 23 students ranging from age 5 to 15 filled the benches. A new teacher, Miss Sarah Thompson, fresh from normal school back east, stood beside her, ready to help manage the growing enrollment. Elena looked out at the eager faces before her and saw possibility in every one of them. These children would learn reading and arithmetic, yes, but they'd also learn that education was freedom, that choices mattered, that their lives belonged to them regardless of what circumstances they were born into. Welcome, Elena said, her voice steady and sure. This is a place where everyone is valued, where mistakes are part of learning, where your voice matters. You're not just here to memorize facts, you're here to discover who you are and who you want to become. That's the most important lesson you'll ever learn. The students listened with the kind of attention that told Elena they understood, at least partially, that they were being offered something special. She began the day's lesson feeling more certain than ever that she'd found her purpose. That evening, as Elena and Caleb prepared dinner while Molly did homework at the table, a comfortable domesticity filled the house. This was her life now, teaching, parenting, partnership, belonging. Simple and beautiful and hers. Elena, Molly said suddenly, looking up from her arithmetic, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Do you think about the day Daddy bought you? When you were scared and in chains? The question created a moment of heavy silence. Elena exchanged a glance with Caleb, then sat down beside Molly, taking the question seriously. Sometimes, Elena admitted, usually when I'm teaching and I see a student who's struggling or scared, it reminds me of how lost I felt, how certain I was that my life was over. But it wasn't over, Molly said. It was just starting. The real one, I mean. You're right, Elena said softly. That day was terrible, but it led to everything good I have now, to your father, to you, to teaching, to this family. Sometimes the worst moments break us open so new things can grow. Like how you have to break open a seed for it to sprout? Molly asked, making the connection with childlike clarity. Exactly like that. Elena hugged her. You're very wise for 7 years old. Almost 8, Molly corrected. My birthday is next month, remember? As they planned Molly's birthday celebration, Elena felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Not gratitude for what had happened to her, that auction would always be a trauma she'd carry, but gratitude for what she'd built from the wreckage. She'd transformed survival into purpose, fear into courage, brokenness into strength. The first snow arrived in early November, earlier than usual. Elena stood at the schoolhouse window watching fat flakes drift down, thinking about the year that had passed. 12 months ago, she'd been learning to sleep without nightmares, learning to trust Caleb's kindness, learning to believe in the possibility of a future. Now she was married, a mother, a successful teacher, and most importantly, fully herself. Miss Elena, is school canceled if the snow gets too deep? Timothy Henderson asked, hopeful. Nice try, Timothy. A little snow won't stop us. But if it gets dangerous, your parents won't send you, so enjoy the math lesson while you can. The students groaned good-naturedly and returned to their work. Elena moved among them, offering help where needed, feeling that familiar sense of purpose that teaching always brought. These children were her legacy as much as any children she might bear. She was shaping futures, opening possibilities, giving them tools to build better lives. That evening, she returned home to find Caleb and Molly building a snowman in the front yard. Molly shrieked with delight when she saw Elena and ran over, covered in snow and grinning. Look! We gave him a carrot nose and button eyes and everything. Elena admired their creation, then joined in, helping them add stick arms and a tattered scarf for decoration. They played until the cold drove them inside, tracking snow through the kitchen while they made hot cocoa and laughed about nothing in particular. Later, after Molly had gone to bed, Elena stood at the bedroom window watching more snowfall. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. "Completely," Elena said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. On Christmas morning, Molly woke them before dawn, too excited to sleep any longer. They gathered around the small tree Caleb had cut from the creek bottom, decorated with paper chains Molly had made and a star carved from wood. The gifts were simple: a new slate for Molly, warm gloves for Caleb, books for Elena, but they represented something profound. A family celebrating together, secure in their love and belonging. "I have something for you," Caleb said to Elena after Molly had torn through her presents. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. Elena opened it to find two tiny photographs, one of Molly, one of Caleb. "So you carry us with you always," Caleb said softly, "a reminder that you belong here, with us, permanently." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. The cool metal settled against her skin, a tangible reminder of the family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her in return. As winter deepened, Elena found herself thinking about the future with increasing clarity. She wanted to expand the school further, maybe establish a lending library for the community. She wanted to have a child with Caleb, to experience pregnancy and birth with the support of the community rather than the isolation and fear that had surrounded Rachel's death. She wanted to grow old on this prairie, watching Molly become a woman, teaching generations of children, building a legacy of kindness and education. One February evening, as they sat by the fire, Elena said suddenly, "I think I'm ready." Caleb looked up from the book he'd been reading. "Ready for what?" "To try for a baby, to expand our family." Elena met his eyes steadily. "I'm not afraid anymore. I know that terrible things can happen, that nothing is guaranteed. But I also know that living in fear of what might go wrong means missing out on everything that could go right." Caleb set down his book, his expression serious. "Are you certain?" "There's no rush, Elena. We have time." "I'm certain," Elena said firmly. "I want to build this life fully, completely, without holding anything back. That includes bringing new life into this family, if we're blessed with it." By early spring, Elena's suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant. The news brought a complex mix of joy and terror, excitement and anxiety. But she was surrounded by support in ways Rachel hadn't been. Mrs. Patterson checked on her regularly, sharing wisdom from birthing 8 children of her own. The new doctor who'd recently arrived in town was competent and reassuring, and Caleb was attentive without being overbearing, treating Elena like she was capable of growing a human while also precious and worthy of care. Molly was ecstatic about becoming a big sister. She immediately began planning everything the baby would need, drawing elaborate pictures of the nursery and making lists of names she deemed acceptable. "If it's a girl, she should be named Rose," Molly announced one evening. "And if it's a boy, he should be named after Daddy." "Those are beautiful suggestions," Elena said diplomatically, hiding her smile at Molly's certainty. As Elena's belly grew, so did her sense of completion. She was building everything she'd dreamed of during those dark days of captivity. A family, a purpose, a life marked by choice and love rather than trauma and fear. The baby growing inside her felt like a promise that the future held joy rather than pain, possibility rather than limitation. On a warm May evening, exactly 1 year after her wedding, Elena went into labor. It was long and difficult, hours of pain that tested her resolve and strength. But Mrs. Patterson was there, and the doctor, and Caleb holding her hand and reminding her to breathe, to push, to keep going when she thought she couldn't. And finally, as the sun rose on a new day, Elena heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her daughter's first cry. "She's perfect," the doctor said, placing the tiny squalling infant on Elena's chest. "Completely perfect." Elena looked down at her daughter, red-faced and furious at being born, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, fierce love. This was her child, born free, born wanted, born into a family that would protect and nurture her. Everything Elena had survived, every moment of pain and fear, had led to this moment. "What's her name?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. Elena looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. They'd discussed this, had agreed on it weeks ago. "Rachel," Elena said softly. "Rachel Grace Rowan." Caleb's eyes filled with tears at hearing his first wife's name given to this new daughter. It was Elena's gift to him, acknowledging that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that honoring the past doesn't mean being trapped by it. When Molly was finally allowed in to meet her baby sister, her expression of wonder made every moment of labor worthwhile. "She's so small," Molly whispered, gently touching Rachel's tiny hand. "And perfect." "Can I hold her?" With careful guidance, they arranged it so Molly could hold her sister. The sight of her two daughters together made Elena's heart feel almost too full to contain. "Thank you," Molly said suddenly, looking up at Elena with complete sincerity, "for being my mama and giving me a sister and making our family complete." "Thank you for letting me be part of your family," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. Over the following months, life settled into a new normal, defined by sleepless nights and baby cries, and the profound joy of watching a tiny human grow. Elena took time away from teaching to focus on Rachel, but she maintained involvement with the school, planning curriculum, and meeting with Miss Thompson weekly. On a golden October afternoon, Elena sat on the porch with baby Rachel sleeping in her arms, while Molly and Caleb worked in the garden. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, grass turned amber by the changing season. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called, and closer by, the chickens clucked contentedly. Elena thought about the journey that had brought her here, the auction block, the chains, the terror of believing her life was over before it had truly begun. She thought about Caleb stepping forward with all his money and asking nothing in return, about Molly's immediate acceptance and love, about the community that had rallied to protect her, about the school she'd built and the students whose lives she was shaping. She looked down at Rachel, at this tiny person who would never know the fear Elena had lived through. This daughter would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she belonged, knowing that her body and her life were her own to command. She would learn strength and kindness in equal measure, would understand that survival could transform into purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, joining her on the porch, Molly trailing behind him. "Everything," Elena said simply. "The past year, the past 2 years. How impossibly far I've come from that girl in chains." "You were never just a girl in chains," Caleb said firmly. "Even then, you were someone extraordinary. The chains were just temporary circumstances that couldn't define who you really are." Molly climbed onto Elena's lap carefully, mindful of her sleeping sister. "Tell me the story again," she requested, "about how Daddy saved you and you saved yourself." It had become Molly's favorite bedtime story, though highly edited for a child's understanding. Elena told it again now, in the golden afternoon light, with her family gathered close. She told it not as a trauma to be survived, but as a journey to be learned from, a story of darkness that had led to light. As she finished, Rachel stirred and opened her eyes, focusing on Elena's face with that intense newborn gaze that seemed to see straight into your soul. Elena smiled down at her daughter, this child born of love and choice and the deliberate building of a better future. "Welcome to the world, little one," Elena whispered. "You're going to love it here." And as the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in impossible shades of gold and rose, Elena sat surrounded by her family and felt the profound peace of someone who'd found their way home. Not just to a place, but to herself, to purpose and love and belonging, to a life she'd chosen, built piece by piece from the wreckage of her worst nightmare. She was no longer a girl sold by others, but a woman who'd chosen her own future. And that future stretched before her, bright and beautiful and infinitely possible, full of children to teach and love to give, and days to live fully rather than merely survive. The journey from the auction block to this porch had been long and painful and transformative. But sitting here now, with her husband beside her, and her daughters in her arms, and the prairie breeze carrying the scent of coming winter, Elena knew with absolute certainty that every moment of pain had been worth it. She was home. She was whole. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And that was more than enough.